Hello everyone, and welcome back to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to fall asleep, and I am here to deliver. But before starting, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. This happened a few years ago, but I still think about it every single day. It's one of those experiences that you don't just move on from. No matter how much time passes, it lingers in the back of your mind, forcing you to question everything you once believed was normal. At the time, I was living alone in a small 2-bedroom house in a quiet town. It wasn't anything fancy, just a modest place with an old charm, the kind of house you'd drive past without a second glance. It had a creaky wooden floor, slightly outdated kitchen cabinets, and a backyard that was mostly just overgrown grass and a rusting shed I never bothered to use. The house had been built in the late 50s, but I wasn't too concerned about its age. It had character, and I liked that. I had moved there after getting a new job in a nearby city. The commute wasn't too bad, just about 30 minutes each way. The neighborhood was peaceful, full of older residents who kept to themselves. The kind of place where nothing ever happened. It was exactly what I needed, at least, that's what I thought. Most of my days were spent working, coming home, eating dinner, watching TV, and going to bed. My life wasn't particularly exciting, but I was content. My routine was predictable, and I found comfort in that. The house had a strange layout, though. The bedrooms were separated by a single wall, and the walls themselves were oddly thick. Sound didn't travel through them easily, which I only really noticed when I started sleeping in the back bedroom instead of the one near the front. It was quieter, which I liked, but there was something unsettling about it. Maybe it was the way the air always felt slightly heavier in there, or how I always woke up feeling a little disoriented, like I had been dreaming but couldn't remember about what. Still, I brushed it off. It was an old house, of course. It was going to have quirks. The first few months passed without anything unusual happening. I adjusted to my new routine, got to know a few of my neighbors, and even started fixing up the place a little. I repainted the living room, replaced some of the bathroom fixtures, and tightened a few loose floorboards in the hallway. Normal stuff. But there was one thing I never really paid much attention to until later: the wall. It was just a wall. Nothing special about it. Just a plain white divider between the two bedrooms. I had put a bookshelf against it in the back bedroom, mostly to make the space feel a little cozier. It wasn't until later that I started realizing there was something different about it. I didn't know it yet, but my peaceful routine was about to change. I can't say exactly when I started noticing it. It wasn't like there was one big, obvious moment where I realized something was wrong. It was more like a slow drip, tiny things, little details that I brushed off at first, until they started adding up in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. The first time I felt something was off, I was in bed, half asleep. It had been a long day at work, and I was exhausted. The room was completely silent except for the occasional creak of the old house settling, which was normal. But then, just as I was slipping into sleep, I heard a faint sound. It wasn't loud or aggressive, just the softest noise coming from the wall beside me. At first, I thought it was nothing. Probably just the wood expanding or shifting with the temperature. But then, a few nights later, it happened again. Same time, same place. A light, almost rhythmic sound, like something tapping inside the wall. Not loud. Not forceful, just there. I sat up and listened, but the moment I did, it stopped. I got out of bed, pressed my ear against the wall, and waited. Nothing, just the silence of the house at night. Still, I didn't like it. It was one of those sounds that you don't just forget. It sticks in your mind, makes you pay attention even when you don't want to. But I told myself it was probably just the house settling. Old wood, old nails. Nothing unusual. I went back to bed. That should have been the end of it. But the next morning, something happened that made me uneasy in a way I couldn't explain. I was getting ready for work, still groggy from sleep. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a cup of coffee, and was about to sit down when I noticed something on the counter. A glass! It was sitting in the middle of the counter, perfectly upright. Not knocked over, not at an angle, just placed there, as if someone had set it down carefully. Now, I wasn't the neatest person in the world, but I knew for a fact I hadn't left it there. The night before, I had washed all my dishes and put them away in the cupboard. I lived alone. There was no one else in the house who could have touched it. I stared at it for a long time. It wasn't like it was anything terrifying. Just a glass. But the way it sat there, perfectly centered on the counter, made me feel uneasy. Maybe I had just forgotten. Maybe I had taken a glass out and left it there without realizing it. That was the logical answer. But something about it didn't sit right with me. I picked it up, placed it back in the cupboard, and tried to forget about it. That day at work, I kept thinking about it. Not in a panicked way, just an unsettled, nagging kind of way. The kind of feeling you get when you know something isn't quite right, but you can't put your finger on what. That night, the tapping sound came back. I was ready for it this time. As soon as I heard it, I turned on my bedside lamp and sat up. It wasn't loud, but it was steady. A faint, rhythmic tapping. Not frantic, not random, consistent. I pressed my palm against the wall, hoping to feel something. Nothing. The tapping stopped the moment my hand touched the surface. I waited. After a long pause, I took my hand away and turned off the light. And then, just as I was lying back down, it started again. I felt a chill creep up my spine. This wasn't normal. This wasn't the house settling. I turned the light back on. Silence. I kept it on for the rest of the night. The next morning, I searched the wall, looking for any sign of mice or some kind of logical explanation. I knocked along the surface, checking for hollow spots. Nothing. It was solid. I even went outside to see if there was anything against that part of the house. But all that was there was the empty space between my house and the neighbor's fence. No trees, no pipes, no vents, nothing that could be making that sound. Still, I tried to let it go. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe it was just the way old houses behaved. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The following night, things escalated. I woke up suddenly, feeling like something had jolted me awake. My heart was pounding, but I didn't know why. The room was silent. My bedside lamp was still on. Everything looked normal, but I had the overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone. I sat there, listening, watching. Nothing moved. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. The bookshelf. The one against the wall. One of the books had shifted. Not fallen. Just moved. Like someone had pulled it forward slightly. I stared at it for what felt like forever. It didn't make sense. Books don't just move on their own. I stood up, walked over, and pushed it back into place. My hands were clammy. I didn't want to admit it, but I was scared. The air in the room felt heavy, thick, like something was watching me. I turned around, half expecting to see something standing there. But there was nothing. Just the empty room, the dim light casting shadows along the walls. I told myself it was my imagination, that I was tired, that maybe I had bumped the bookshelf earlier without realizing it. But I didn't go back to sleep that night. And the next day, when I came home from work, something else was wrong. The glass. The same one from before. It was back on the counter, in the exact same spot. And this time, I knew for a fact I hadn't touched it. At this point, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was happening in my house, and it wasn't just my imagination. The tapping inside the wall, the moved book, the glass returning to the counter, none of it made sense. But instead of being terrified, I was more unsettled than anything. It was like a slow, creeping paranoia had started to settle into my bones. That night, I forced myself to stay awake, determined to catch whatever was happening in real time. I turned off the lights, sat up in bed, and just listened. The house was silent. The air felt thick, like I was holding my breath, even though I wasn't. Then, sometime around 2 in the morning, I heard it again. The tapping. But this time, it wasn't just a few faint knocks. It was deliberate. A steady, rhythmic pattern, like someone was on the other side of the wall, pressing their fingers against it. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and aimed it at the wall. I don't know what I was expecting to see. Cracks, movement, maybe even something shifting in the shadows, but there was nothing. Just smooth, unremarkable drywall. I placed my hand against it, feeling for vibrations. Nothing. But the second I took my hand away, the tapping started again. I swallowed hard. My throat was dry. It felt like, whatever this was, it knew when I was paying attention. And that thought sent a wave of unease through me. I wasn't dealing with old pipes or settling wood. This was something else. The next night, the power went out. I had been sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself from the lingering feeling of unease that had become my new normal. The lamp beside me flickered once, twice, then everything went dark. At first, I thought it was just a neighborhood outage. I got up, checked my phone. The battery was at 40%, but there was no internet, no Wi-Fi. I went to the window and looked outside. The streetlights were still on. The neighbor's house had lights glowing through their curtains. Just my house. I turned back toward the living room, feeling my way through the darkness. The air was colder than usual. Not like a normal loss of power where the house gradually cools down. It was immediate, like something had sucked the warmth out of the room. I reached for my flashlight, but before I could turn it on, I heard something from the hallway. Footsteps. Not heavy, not hurried, slow, deliberate. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. The footsteps moved closer, soft, almost cautious, like they were testing the floorboards. I gripped my phone so tightly my knuckles ached. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. Silence! I forced myself to take a step forward, then another. My pulse pounded in my ears. I reached the hallway, lifted my phone, and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness. Empty. Nothing there. But the floorboards were still creaking, like someone was standing there, shifting their weight. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the space in front of me. My whole body was tense, waiting for something to move, waiting for something to reveal itself. But nothing did. After what felt like forever, the lights flickered back on. The house was still. I exhaled shakily, my breath unsteady. I didn't sleep that night. By now, I knew I couldn't keep ignoring what was happening. Something was wrong with this house. I needed answers. The next morning, I decided to inspect the wall more closely. The tapping, the sounds, the strange occurrences, they all seemed to revolve around it. I moved the bookshelf aside, exposing the bare white surface. And that's when I saw it. A small hole. It wasn't large, maybe the size of a dime, but it hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. I bent down, peering into it. The inside was dark, but there was a strange, faint scent coming from it. Not mold, not wood, something stale. I grabbed a flashlight and aimed it inside. The space beyond the hole wasn't empty. There was something back there. Something pressed against the wall. I couldn't see what it was, but the way the light hit it, I could make out an edge, something solid buried inside. My stomach twisted. I needed to know what was in there. I grabbed a screwdriver and started widening the hole, chipping away at the drywall, breaking off pieces until the opening was big enough to reach inside. My hands were shaking. My pulse thumped against my ribs. I reached in. The space was tight, barely wide enough for my fingers to move. The material inside was rough, uneven. Then I felt it. Something smooth. Something not wood. I wrapped my fingers around it and pulled. It didn't come easily. It was wedged in there, like it had been placed inside deliberately. I adjusted my grip and tugged harder. And then, finally, it came free. I stumbled back, nearly dropping it. It was a piece of paper. Old, yellowed, brittle at the edges. Folded up neatly, like a note someone had hidden away. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. My hands were shaking as I unfolded it. There were only 4 words written on it. Do not look inside. A cold chill ran through me. I looked back at the hole. I had already looked inside. After that, the house felt different. It wasn't just the sounds anymore. It wasn't just the tapping. It was the feeling of being watched. Every room, every hallway, no matter where I stood, I felt it. The weight of something unseen. The way the shadows stretched a little too far when I turned my back. The worst part, it wasn't just inside the house anymore. One night, as I was pulling into the driveway, I saw something in the window. A shape, standing there, watching me. I killed the engine, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move, just stood there in the dim light, its form barely visible through the curtain. I couldn't move. Then, slowly, it backed away, into the darkness. I didn't go inside for a long time. I just sat there in my car, gripping the steering wheel, my knuckles white. I wasn't alone in that house. Something else was in there with me, and it had been there long before I ever moved in. I couldn't keep ignoring it. Whatever was in my house wasn't just some passing presence, some vague, unsettling feeling. It was aware. It was deliberate. And after finding that note inside the wall, things had escalated beyond anything I could rationalize. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard it. The soft tapping, the creak of floorboards shifting under unseen weight, the faint breath of something moving just out of sight. And worse, every morning, something was off. The kitchen chair pulled out just a little too far. The hallway light turned on when I knew I had switched it off. A door left slightly open when I was sure I had closed it the night before. Small things, subtle, but enough to let me know I wasn't alone. Enough to make me feel like I was being played with. One night, I sat at my desk, exhausted but wired with paranoia. The note I had found in the wall sat beside me, its 4 words burned into my mind. Do not look inside. I picked it up, turning it over, half expecting something else to be scrawled on the back. But it was blank. A dead end. Or at least, that's what I thought, until I noticed something. The edges of the paper. The way they were uneven, slightly frayed, like it had been torn from a larger piece. My stomach dropped. There was more. I stood abruptly, knocking over my chair. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed a flashlight, a screwdriver, and made my way back to the wall. The hole was still there, a jagged wound in the drywall, gaping and dark. I knelt down, aimed the flashlight inside. The space beyond was bigger than I had realized before. I reached in again, fingers brushing against the rough interior. And then I felt it. Another piece of paper. I pulled it out carefully, my breath tight in my chest. It was the same as the first, aged, yellowed, brittle. But this one had more words. My hands trembled as I read them. If you see it, do not speak. If you hear it, do not answer. If it moves, do not run. A cold chill crawled up my spine. I sat there, staring at the note, my pulse hammering in my ears. Then I heard it. A voice. Soft, hoarse, right behind me. Why did you look? I spun around so fast I nearly lost my balance. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness. Nothing. The room was empty. But I felt it. The air had changed. Thick, heavy, charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. My breath came in short, shallow gasps. Then something moved. Not in front of me. Not beside me. Above me. A slow, deliberate creak from the ceiling. I lifted the flashlight, and I saw it. A figure, crawling across the ceiling, limbs too long, body twisted in ways that didn't make sense. Its face, if it had one, was obscured by shadow, but I could see its eyes. Dark, hollow, fixed directly on me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Then, in a voice that barely sounded human, it spoke again. You weren't supposed to look. My body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. The thing clung to the ceiling, unmoving, waiting, watching. And then it moved. Fast. Too fast. Before I could react, it dropped. I stumbled back, hitting the wall hard. My flashlight flickered as I scrambled to get up. The figure landed soundlessly, its form shifting in the dim light. I still couldn't see its face, but I could hear it breathing. Shallow, ragged. It took a step forward. I couldn't blink, couldn't look away. Then I remembered the note. If it moves, do not run. I clenched my jaw, forcing my legs to stay still even though every instinct in my body was screaming at me to bolt. The thing tilted its head, as if studying me. I gripped the flashlight, my hands trembling. It took another step. Closer now. So close I could feel it. The air around it was wrong. Cold, suffocating, like being buried alive. It leaned in, inches from my face. Then it whispered something. Not in English. Not in any language I understood. But I felt the meaning, and I knew I had broken something. A rule. A boundary. I had done what I wasn't supposed to do. And now there was no taking it back. The thing didn't attack me. It didn't lunge, didn't lash out. Instead, it straightened slowly, its body contorting unnaturally as it did. Then it backed away, step by step, fading into the shadows. I didn't dare move. Not until the room was silent again. Not until I was sure it was gone. But I knew this wasn't over. It had let me go. For now. I don't remember how long I stood there, my back pressed against the wall, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The flashlight trembled in my grip, its dim glow barely piercing the darkness. The thing was gone. But the house didn't feel empty. Something in the air had changed, subtle but undeniable. It felt expectant, like the walls were holding their breath. I forced myself to move, one slow step at a time. My body was stiff, my muscles locked with tension. Every part of me was screaming to get out, to leave the house and never return. But where would I go? This was my home. My only home. And worse, what if it followed me? What if I had let something loose? The thought sent a wave of nausea rolling through me. I couldn't think about that now. I needed to focus. I needed to do something. I turned back to the hole in the wall, my fingers tightening around the crumpled notes I had found inside. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Someone had left those messages. Someone who had known about it. Had they lived here before me? Had they been trying to warn me? Or had they failed? I suddenly felt like an intruder in my own home. I grabbed my phone and searched for any record of the house's history. I had never bothered to look into it before. I had just assumed it was like any other old building, with its creaky floors and outdated wiring. But now I needed answers. What I found made my stomach drop. The property records were sparse, but they told enough of a story to make my blood run cold. The house had been sold multiple times over the past few decades. No owner had stayed longer than 2 years. No explanations, no reasons listed, just a pattern of people leaving, one after another. And then, buried deep in an old newspaper archive, I found something worse. An article from nearly 30 years ago. A missing persons case. The previous owner, one of the many who had lived here briefly, had vanished without a trace. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of struggle. Just gone. Neighbors had reported hearing strange noises from the house in the weeks before his disappearance. Tapping, scratching, whispers. I dropped my phone, my hands shaking. I wasn't the first. I might not be the last. Panic surged through me, raw and consuming. I needed to leave. I rushed through the house, grabbing essentials, a bag, my wallet, my keys. But as I moved, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed deeper, every doorway darker. I stepped into the hallway and froze. The front door was open. I hadn't opened it. A slow, creeping dread crawled up my spine. Something wanted me to leave. But why? Because it was done with me? Or because it knew I had nowhere to run? I stood there, my pulse thundering in my ears. If I stepped outside, would I be free? Or would I be walking into something worse? I took a shaky breath. And then I did something I still can't fully explain. I closed the door. Not because I wanted to stay, but because I needed to know. I turned back toward the hallway, toward the room where it had revealed itself. I wasn't going to run. Not yet. I gripped the flashlight tighter and forced myself forward. My footsteps were slow, deliberate. The house felt like it was waiting. The air was thick, suffocating. I reached the bedroom. The hole in the wall gaped open, jagged and dark. And then I saw it. Not the thing itself, but something new. Another note, right in front of the hole. It hadn't been there before. My hands trembled as I bent down to pick it up. The paper was the same, aged, fragile, but the message was different. Shorter. First, you should have left. A slow, crawling realization settled over me. I hadn't been meant to stay. I had been given a chance to leave, and I had closed the door. I looked up, and the lights went out. Darkness swallowed the room. Not just the absence of light, something deeper, thicker, the kind that seeps into your bones, that makes you question if your eyes are even open. The house had gone silent, but I wasn't alone. I couldn't see it, but I felt it. Something was there, just beyond my reach. Waiting, watching. I didn't move, didn't breathe. My fingers clenched around the note, its fragile edges crumbling against my skin. You should have left. The words burned in my mind. Then, in the darkness, a sound. Faint at first, almost imperceptible. A slow, deliberate tapping, somewhere along the walls. The air in the room shifted. The pressure around me changed, like the entire house was breathing. I reached for my phone, my fingers fumbling over the cold screen. The flashlight flicked on, its weak glow shaking as I lifted it. And then I saw it. The hole in the wall, wider now, like something had forced it open from the inside. The tapping grew louder, closer. No more hesitation. I ran. I didn't think, didn't look back. My feet barely touched the floor as I tore through the hallway, my body moving on pure instinct. The walls seemed narrower, pressing in on me as I reached the front door. My breath came in short, ragged bursts, my heartbeat a violent hammering in my chest. I yanked the door open, and the night air hit me like a shock of ice. Everything outside was still, too still. The street was empty. The wind had died. No rustling leaves, no distant traffic. Just a hollow, unnatural quiet. But I didn't care. I was out. I stumbled onto the front steps, my legs weak beneath me. My skin was cold, my clothes clinging to my damp skin. My mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. Had it let me go? Or was I still in its grip? I never stepped back inside that house. I left everything, furniture, clothes, memories. None of it mattered. By morning, I had already found a motel. By the end of the week, I had signed a lease on a small apartment across town. But the house still haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had brought something with me. At night, I'd wake up gasping, certain I had heard something in the walls. A faint tapping, a breath just beyond my ear. And sometimes, when I was half asleep, caught between waking and dreaming, I'd feel it. That same presence. The house still stands, untouched. A for sale sign sits crookedly in the yard, swaying in the wind. No one stays for long. It was late fall, one of those nights where the cold wraps around you like a second skin. The air smelled like damp earth and fallen leaves, the kind of scent that always made me think of childhood camping trips. But this wasn't some fun, nostalgic night outdoors. This was a drive I had made 100 times before, one that should have been completely ordinary. I had just finished a shift at the auto shop where I worked. Long hours, grease under my nails, the sharp scent of motor oil clinging to my clothes. Nothing out of the ordinary. By the time I clocked out, it was close to midnight, and I was exhausted. My route home was simple. A stretch of highway cutting through the woods, past a couple of abandoned farmhouses, and over a hollow bridge, an old steel structure that groaned under the weight of passing cars. Nobody liked driving over that bridge at night. The metal framework cast strange shadows under the headlights, and the river below always seemed unnaturally dark, like something deeper than water waited beneath the surface. I never paid much attention to the stories about it. Every small town has that one place where people swear they've seen something. Some say a woman walks the bridge in a long dress. Others talk about strange lights flickering beneath the water. None of it mattered to me. It was just another stretch of road. That night, I wasn't alone. My friend Nathan was riding shotgun, half asleep with his hood pulled up, arms crossed over his chest. He had come by the shop to hang out, but once closing time hit, he crashed hard. Typical. He was the kind of guy who could fall asleep anywhere. Loud bar, silent library, middle of a conversation. I, on the other hand, always needed absolute silence to rest. I kept the radio low, letting the faint hum of static fill the car. The heater was on just enough to keep the windshield from fogging up. Miles of empty road stretched ahead, lined with tall, bare trees that swayed slightly in the wind. I glanced at the clock. 12:17 a.m. We were about 3 minutes from the bridge when I noticed something strange. A light, small and faint, flickering up ahead near the road. I didn't think much of it at first. Probably a reflection from a sign or a passing car on a distant road. But the longer I looked, the more I realized it wasn't moving. It just hung there, hovering right before the entrance to the bridge. I slowed down slightly, shifting my grip on the wheel. Nathan stirred beside me, but he didn't wake up. The closer we got, the more I started to feel it, that weight. That same heavy, pressing feeling, like the air was thicker here than anywhere else. The light wasn't coming from a car or a street lamp. In fact, there was no obvious source at all. It was just there. A cold, crawling sensation crept up my spine. My hands tightened on the wheel. The headlights cut through the darkness, casting long shadows on the road. But as we passed under the bridge's rusted beams, the light vanished. Not like it had faded or blinked out. 1 second, it was there. The next, it was simply gone. I let out a slow breath, shaking my head. Just my eyes playing tricks on me. That's what I told myself. But something in my gut knew better, and I was about to find out just how wrong I was. I kept my hands steady on the wheel, my fingers gripping the worn leather a little tighter than before. I wasn't the type to spook easily. Late nights, long stretches of empty road, I was used to that. But something about that light didn't sit right with me. Nathan shifted beside me, muttering something under his breath before falling silent again. His hood was still up, his head tilted toward the window. He hadn't seen the light. He hadn't felt it. I exhaled slowly and focused on the road ahead. The bridge loomed over us, its rusted steel beams stretching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The weight of the structure made my car feel smaller, like we were passing through something older, heavier, watching. The moment we reached the center of the bridge, the radio cut out. Not just static, not just a flicker. Silence! I glanced at the console. The screen was still on, showing the station number, but no sound came through. Just a flat, empty absence where music should have been. Nathan shifted again, groggily lifting his head. Did you turn it off? His voice was thick with sleep. No, I muttered, twisting the knob. Nothing. A quiet pressure settled over the car, something I couldn't explain. The kind of quiet that didn't feel natural. It wasn't just the radio. It was the air itself. Nathan sat up straighter, rubbing his face. Feels weird in here. I didn't answer. I just focused on the road. The car rolled forward, the tires humming against the asphalt. The exit was only a few hundred feet ahead. Just keep moving. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure standing on the side of the bridge. My pulse slammed against my ribs. It was just a shadow at first, barely more than a dark shape against the steel framework. I blinked, trying to focus. It wasn't moving, just standing there, close to the railing. A hitchhiker? Someone stranded? At this hour? I turned my head slightly for a better look, and my stomach dropped. The figure wasn't standing on the road. It was on the outside of the railing, perched on the narrow ledge, facing the water below. A sick, twisting sensation curled in my gut. I pressed my foot slightly against the brake, unsure whether I should stop or keep going. Nathan frowned. What? I started, but as soon as the words left my mouth, the figure was gone. Not like they jumped, not like they moved, just gone. I slammed the brakes. The tires screeched against the asphalt, jerking us both forward. What the hell? Nathan snapped, gripping the dashboard. I stared at the spot where the figure had been. The railing was empty. The ledge was empty. Nothing but the dark expanse of the river below. I saw someone, I said, my voice tight. Nathan followed my gaze, squinting into the darkness. There's no one there. I swallowed hard, my hands still gripping the wheel. I knew what I had seen. I wasn't exhausted enough to start hallucinating. But the longer I stared, the more the bridge seemed to swallow the memory, like it had never been there at all. The silence stretched. Nathan let out a slow breath and ran a hand through his hair. Maybe it was a trick of the light. I wanted to agree. I wanted to believe that. But that sick feeling in my stomach hadn't faded. Something wasn't right. Nathan sighed. Dude, let's just go. You're freaking me out. I hesitated for a second longer before finally pressing my foot back on the gas. The car rolled forward, and the bridge passed behind us, swallowed by the night. For the next few miles, neither of us said a word. The road stretched on, winding through the trees, and the feeling of something watching us never left. By the time we reached my house, the tension had settled into my bones like an ache. Nathan didn't say much as he got out of the car, rubbing his arms against the cold. You sure you're good? He asked, eyeing me. I nodded, forcing a shrug. Yeah, just tired. He didn't push it, just mumbled a quick, see you tomorrow, and walked off toward his place down the block. I stood by my car for a moment, watching him disappear into the shadows. The night was quiet. No winds, no distant cars. Too quiet. I should have gone inside, locked the door, crawled into bed and let exhaustion take over. But instead, I turned and looked back toward the highway. And that's when I saw it again. The figure, standing at the far end of my street. Not moving, not walking, just standing. And even from the distance, I could tell. It was facing me. I didn't sleep that night. Even after locking the door, double-checking the windows, and pacing around my room like an idiot, sleep never came. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure standing at the end of my street, still and silent, watching. I had turned away for just a second, just long enough to look at my phone, to tell myself I was losing it. When I glanced back, it was gone. That should have been the end of it. I should have been able to chalk it up to exhaustion, to stress, to anything logical. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just some random trick of the night. It wasn't just a shadow. I didn't tell Nathan. He'd already made it clear he thought I was overreacting. He'd just roll his eyes, tell me I needed more sleep, and move on. And maybe that was fair. Maybe I did need more sleep. But that didn't explain what happened next. The next night, it started. I had just turned off the TV, the screen flashing to black as the reflection of my living room settled in the glass. The apartment was quiet. A heavy kind of quiet, the kind that felt unnatural, like the walls were holding their breath. I stood up, stretched, and went to shut the blinds. That's when I heard it. A scraping sound. Not loud, not obvious, just soft enough to make me freeze. It came from outside, somewhere near my window. A slow, deliberate dragging noise, like something sharp being pulled across metal. I didn't move. I held my breath, listening. The sound came again, closer this time. My apartment was on the second floor. There shouldn't have been anyone outside my window. Heart pounding, I took a slow step toward the blinds. Every instinct screamed at me to leave them shut, to walk away and pretend I hadn't heard anything. But I couldn't. I had to know. I reached out, fingertips barely grazing the edge of the blinds. The scraping stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, frozen in place, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Nothing did. Finally, I exhaled and let go of the blinds, forcing a shaky laugh at myself. I was losing it. But just as I turned away, 3 slow taps. Right against the glass. I spun back around so fast I nearly tripped. My breath caught in my throat. Nothing. No movement. No shadows. Just my own pale reflection staring back at me in the dark glass. I stayed up the rest of the night. The next day, I told myself I was done being paranoid. I had work to do, errands to run. I wasn't going to let some weird noises or a shadow on a bridge get to me. By the time the sun set, I almost felt normal again. Nathan texted, asking if I wanted to grab food, but I wasn't in the mood. I told him I was heading out for a late-night drive instead, just to clear my head. I took the same route as before. I didn't want to, but something about that bridge pulled at me. I needed to see it again, to prove to myself that it was just an ordinary place, just another road. The air was thick with humidity, the pavement still warm from the day's heat. The trees lining the highway stood motionless, their dark branches stretching overhead. As I neared the bridge, the hairs on my arms stood up. The streetlights flickered. Not all of them, just the one closest to my car. It sputtered twice, casting jagged shadows across the pavement, then went out completely. I gripped the wheel tighter. I wasn't going to stop. Not this time. But as I passed the darkened streetlight, something moved. A figure, standing just outside the reach of the headlights. I didn't look. I wouldn't look. I pressed my foot on the gas, heart hammering as I left the bridge behind. The tension in my chest eased as the familiar sight of my street came into view. Then my headlights hit something. Someone was standing in front of my apartment building. A tall, dark figure. Waiting. I slammed the brakes, my breath coming in sharp gasps. But when I blinked, it was gone. My body refused to move. My hands stayed locked on the wheel, my eyes glued to the spot where it had been. I wasn't going inside. Not yet. Not until I was sure I was alone. By the next morning, I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was happening. Something I couldn't explain. So I started digging. I looked up everything I could about that bridge. News articles, forums, even old urban legends. And that's when I found it. A story buried deep in an old thread from years ago. Someone else had seen the shadow. A driver, just like me, crossing the bridge late at night. He described the same feeling, the same unsettling silence. And, just like me, he had seen someone standing on the other side of the railing. But that wasn't the worst part. The last sentence of his post stopped me cold. It followed me home. I stared at the screen, my fingers tightening into a fist. It wasn't just me. It had happened before. And if I didn't do something, it would happen again. I didn't go to work that day. I barely slept, barely ate. I just sat there, staring at my laptop screen, rereading that post over and over again. It followed me home. The words burrowed into my mind, looping like a broken record. The same thing had happened to someone else. And if he was telling the truth, then this thing wasn't just some trick of my imagination. It was real. And it was still out there. I forced myself to keep searching. Maybe there were more stories, more details, something that could tell me what I was dealing with. But the thread was old. The original poster hadn't logged in for years. No one else had followed up. It was like the story had just stopped. That's when I saw it. At the very bottom of the page, buried beneath years of inactive posts, a reply. From a user with no profile picture, no information. Just a single sentence. Don't let it in. My stomach turned. I slammed the laptop shut and pushed away from the desk, my breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. But when I turned toward the window, my blood turned to ice. The blinds were open. I knew I had closed them the night before. But now they hung slightly apart, the slats tilted just enough to leave a gap. A dark, narrow gap. And through it, I saw an eye. I didn't move. I couldn't. The air left my lungs in a sharp, ragged exhale. Every muscle in my body locked up, a primal fear wrapping around my spine like a fist. The eye didn't blink. It just stared, unmoving, unblinking, watching. Then, slowly, it pulled away. I lunged forward and ripped the blinds shut, my hands shaking so badly I nearly tore them from the frame. My pulse pounded against my skull. a deafening rhythm of panic and disbelief. I stumbled back, my mind racing. What was I supposed to do? Call the police? Tell them what? That something was watching me? They'd laugh. They'd think I was crazy. And maybe I was. But then I heard it. A sound from inside my apartment. A soft, deliberate creak, like a footstep on the floor. My stomach dropped. It was inside. I turned, heart hammering, eyes darting to every dark corner of the room. The front door was still locked. The windows were shut. But I wasn't alone. I felt it before I saw it, the weight of something standing behind me. The air in the room grew heavy, pressing against my chest like a crushing force. My skin prickled, the hairs on the back of my neck rising in silent warning. And then a shadow moved. I whipped around just as the lights flickered, the overhead bulb dimming to a sickly, pulsing glow. The figure stood in the hallway. Tall, too tall. Its body was wrong. Stretched, distorted, a silhouette that didn't belong. Its head tilted, just slightly, as if it were studying me. My throat closed. My knees nearly gave out beneath me. And then, it stepped forward. I didn't think. I ran. I sprinted for the bedroom, my hands slamming against the door, shoving it shut just as the lights cut out completely. The darkness swallowed everything. My breath came in ragged gasps, the silence pressing against my ears like a weight. Then, a knock. Not at the door. At the closet. I nearly choked on my own breath. I turned, slow, reluctant, like my body already knew what was coming. The closet door stood slightly open, a sliver of pitch black space just wide enough for something to hide. And from that darkness, a hand emerged. Cold, bony, fingers too long, curling slightly against the wood. I stumbled back, my heart slamming against my ribs. Then, before I could react, it moved. Not lunging, not rushing, just stepping forward. Like it knew. Like it had already won. I had to get out. I scrambled for my phone, fingers shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. The screen flickered to life, 3:33 a.m. Then, the closet door creaked open the rest of the way. I didn't look. I couldn't look. But I felt it. It was standing right behind me. The air turned ice cold, freezing against my skin. My breath came in shallow gasps, my vision tunneling. And then, it whispered, right against my ear. My body locked up. My throat closed. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The whisper slithered through the air, a sound that wasn't quite a voice. A sound that didn't belong in this world. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, it was gone. The room was empty. The lights flickered back on. And I was alone. The quiet was suffocating. After the whispering had stopped, after the creature disappeared, everything was still. The air felt thick, like the world itself had been paused. My heart hammered in my chest, my breath shallow and erratic. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what had just happened. But one thing was clear. I couldn't stay. I grabbed my phone again, hands shaking, and I made the call. The operator's voice on the other end sounded distant, as if she were miles away from where I was. My words tumbled out in a mess, but she assured me help was on the way. A few minutes later, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. I didn't wait. I grabbed what I could, my keys, my wallet, a jacket, and bolted out of the apartment. I didn't even lock the door behind me. I didn't care. I didn't feel safe anywhere anymore. The walk down the stairwell was a blur. I could barely focus on anything. My legs were numb, like they didn't belong to me. My mind kept replaying everything. The cold hand, the distorted figure, the whisper that tore through me like a razor blade. By the time I reached the street, I was practically shaking. The cool night air hit my face, and for a moment, I thought I might collapse right there on the sidewalk. But I didn't. I forced myself to keep moving. I kept my head down, my eyes darting to every shadow, every dark corner. Every step felt like it took 1,000 years. The police arrived a few minutes later, but I couldn't even look at them. I couldn't explain what had happened, not properly. How could I? How do you tell someone that there was something in your closet, something that wasn't human? They took the report anyway. They asked all the questions about my mental state, about the sounds they'd heard, about the things I thought I'd seen. They even checked my apartment for signs of break-ins. But of course, there was nothing. Everything was exactly as it should have been. Except for me. I wasn't the same. A week passed. The apartment sat empty. The police didn't find anything suspicious, and I didn't hear anything back about the case. I didn't care. All I cared about was getting out of that place, and I did. I moved into a new apartment, far away from the old one. Somewhere quieter. Somewhere that felt safe. But there was no escaping it. The memories, the fear, the feeling of something watching me, it clung to me, wrapping itself around my thoughts. It'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, the image of that thing still fresh in my mind. Sometimes it'd catch myself staring at the closet door, my breath coming in short gasps as I waited for it to open again. It never did, but I still heard it. I still heard the whisper like a cold breeze against my ear. It never left. One night, I decided to do something about it. I went back to the old apartment. I wasn't sure what I was hoping for. Closure, maybe. Or perhaps I was just trying to prove to myself that it hadn't been real. But when I stood outside the building, staring at the familiar door, I felt my heart rate speed up. I could hear the wind rustling the leaves. I could hear the distant hum of traffic. But there was something else. Something that made my blood run cold. A soft creak, like a door opening. I froze. It came from the apartment. I told myself it was just the building settling. But I knew better. I had to know. I walked into the building, up the stairs, and into the hallway. I wasn't prepared for what I found. The door to my old apartment was ajar. I hadn't left it that way. I hesitated, my fingers brushing the handle. My stomach churned. Every part of me screamed to turn around, to walk away, but I couldn't. I pushed the door open. The apartment was exactly as I had left it. Empty, silent. The blinds were still drawn. The air felt still. But something was off. The closet door was wide open. I didn't even have to look inside. I knew. It was there. It had always been there. Waiting. Watching. But this time, I wasn't afraid. This time, I had a plan. I stepped into the apartment, closing the door behind me. My pulse was steady now. I was done running. I wasn't going to leave until I had answers. I walked toward the closet, every step heavy, my breath slow and controlled. When I reached it, I stood for a moment, staring at the open door. It was silent, but I could feel it. The cold, the pressure, the presence. I stepped forward and looked inside. It was empty. But then, a flicker, a movement. Not in the closet, but behind me. I turned, too late. It was right there. But this time, I wasn't afraid. It'd been running for too long. I wasn't going to let it win. I didn't need to see it anymore. I already knew it for what it was. I spoke, my voice steady and clear. "Leave me alone." There was a pause. Then the whisper came. "You can't escape me." I didn't react. I didn't flinch. And with that, I walked out of the apartment. This time, I left the door wide open, and I never looked back. It's been months since that night, the night I walked out of that apartment, never looking back. The chill that had consumed me, the shadows, the whispers, they faded, but I can never forget. I never want to forget. I still think about it, of course. How could I not? Something had been watching me, something that wasn't supposed to exist. At first, I thought it was all just my mind playing tricks on me. But when it started to feel too real, too powerful, I knew it wasn't just in my head. And even now, I don't know what it was. I can't explain it. Maybe I don't want to. But I think that's the hardest part of all of this. The not knowing. There's no neat conclusion to this story. No tidy resolution. No sense of closure. I still hear the whispers sometimes. They linger in the back of my mind, creeping in when I least expect it. You might be wondering why I went back to that apartment, why I even confronted it in the first place. Why didn't I just leave and forget about it, move on like any rational person would? The truth is, I couldn't. I was driven by something deeper than fear. I had to face it. I had to understand it. The thing I've learned is that some things don't make sense. Some things can't be explained. No matter how much we want to rationalize it, there are things out there that we will never fully comprehend. And for all I know, the thing I encountered that night, the one with the whisper and the cold hand, it's still out there. The worst part, it knows me. It knows where I am, who I am. But I've learned to live with it. I've moved on, in a way. I've found a new place, a new life, though the memories linger. I've come to terms with the fact that not everything is within my control. I can't force answers from the universe or unravel every mystery. Some things are just meant to stay hidden, and maybe that's for the best. But what I do know is this. There are dark corners in this world that we might never fully see, forces at work in the shadows, things that don't play by the rules of logic or reason. The bridge I crossed, the one that led me to that apartment, was more than just a piece of architecture. It was a passage, an entry into something far deeper, far darker. When I left, I didn't feel like I had won. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel free. All I felt was the weight of what I had survived. I don't know why it targeted me, or if it was ever truly finished with me. I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully leave it behind. But I do know one thing. I'll never cross that bridge again. I'll never walk that path. Not because of the fear, but because of the knowledge I now carry. The knowledge that there are things in this world that don't belong. They're hidden, waiting, watching. And sometimes we get too close. We cross over without even realizing it. In the end, though, it doesn't matter how far we run. We can't escape what we've seen, what we've experienced. The shadows follow us, even if we refuse to acknowledge them. They linger in the corners of our minds, in the spaces where light doesn't quite reach. Some things are better left forgotten. But for me, there's no forgetting. I'll always remember the chill that crawled up my spine, the whisper that never quite left my ears. I'll always remember that night when everything changed. And in the quiet moments, when I'm alone, I still hear it, the soft murmur of something that's not quite gone. A shadow that lingers just beyond the edge of sight. The kind of house that's been standing long before anyone in town can remember. The kind that, at first glance, seemed to offer that rustic charm, the one you see on postcards and in movies. Big, with a weathered exterior and a porch that creaked under the weight of the years. To anyone else, it might have just been another house, one of many in the neighborhood. But for me, it felt like something more. Something different. The house had been vacant for several years before we got there. My partner and I were looking for something to start fresh in, somewhere peaceful, away from the noise of city life. It wasn't a place that screamed luxury, but it had a certain character that we couldn't ignore. The old hardwood floors had stories to tell, and the walls had secrets that seemed to echo when you stood still long enough. The town we moved to was small, almost too small, really. Everyone knew everyone, and everything felt like it was just on the edge of being forgotten. The neighbors were friendly, always stopping by to introduce themselves with a warm smile and some homemade pie. But there was an underlying tension in the air, a sort of weight that no one spoke of directly. It was as if the town, and maybe even the house itself, had been waiting for us. I'd always been one to believe in the mundane, the everyday explanations for things. I didn't think of myself as someone who would easily fall prey to superstition or ghost stories. Sure, it heard my share of spooky tales around the campfire, but I thought they were just that, stories. Nothing more. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about this place. The first few weeks were normal. We spent our days unpacking, painting, and making the house feel like ours. The basement, however, was the one place we never ventured into. It wasn't that it was scary. No, it wasn't like that at all. It was just old, dark. The door was a heavy thing, made of wood that had cracked and splintered in places, and every time I walked by it, I felt an odd hesitation. But I chalked it up to being a little nervous about exploring an unfamiliar place. The house, like most old homes, had a strange way of settling. You'd hear creaks, sometimes the odd thud, as if the walls themselves were stretching or shifting. It wasn't anything alarming, just part of the house character, I thought. But then I started noticing small things. Objects out of place, doors that weren't quite where I left them, and an odd draft that seemed to come from the basement. It wasn't cold enough to justify it, but there it was, this unnatural chill. I remember the first time I mentioned it to my partner. We were sitting at the kitchen table one evening, just talking about how things were going. The house had a way of making even the simplest of tasks feel momentous. As I spoke, he looked at me with that "you're imagining things" expression, the one that said he didn't quite get why I was making a big deal of something so small. "It's just an old house," he said with a shrug. "Things like that happen. It's nothing to worry about." He was probably right. After all, what did I know? I wasn't exactly a handyman, and the house was old. Old houses did weird things, right? They had quirks. Maybe the floorboards were settling in a weird way, or the windows were letting in drafts. I tried to push it out of my mind and focus on the good stuff. The fresh air, the space, the quiet. We were free from the hustle of the city after all. But despite my best efforts, the house had a way of making me feel uneasy. At night, the sound of the wind against the windows was louder than usual, like it was howling, trying to tell me something. It made sleep harder to come by, but I just shrugged it off. I'd get used to it, I thought. I always did. Life went on like that for a while, ordinary, with a few odd moments here and there. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me in that basement, something I hadn't quite understood yet. It wasn't until the night everything changed that I realized just how much I had underestimated the house. Something was wrong, and whatever it was, it had been watching us for far longer than we'd ever known. It started with something small, almost too insignificant to notice at first. The kind of thing you'd shrug off if you weren't paying attention, something that, in hindsight, would have been the first clue of many that this house wasn't just old, but alive in its own way. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees and the house settled into its quiet rhythm, I decided to head down to the basement to check on a few things. The furnace had been acting up, and the space down there had been neglected for years before we moved in. It heard a few creaks from below, nothing that raised any alarm, but I figured it was time to at least take a look and see if anything needed fixing. When I reached the top of the stairs leading down to the basement, something caught my attention. The door to the basement was ajar, just slightly, as though it had been left open. I know it closed it earlier that day, locked it, even, just to make sure nothing would get in. I had a habit of checking things twice, and I had definitely made sure the door was shut. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I had forgotten, maybe the wind had pushed it open. But the more I stood there, the more it didn't feel right. The silence of the house, broken only by the steady tick of the old clock in the hallway, began to feel thicker, heavier. I didn't want to admit it to myself, but the feeling in my chest was undeniable. A coldness lingered in the air, a tension that seemed to radiate from the very walls of the house. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, staring at that slightly cracked door. In the dim light of the hallway, it seemed darker in the basement. Too dark. I swallowed hard, trying to convince myself that there was a logical explanation for everything. It wasn't like I was some kind of superstitious person, but there was something unsettling about this moment. Something felt off. My partner was in the living room, watching television. He hadn't heard the door creak or noticed the strange draft that had begun to creep up from below. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. Maybe he was too focused on whatever he was watching. I tried again, louder this time, but still no answer. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open further, feeling the cool air rise up to greet me. The steps leading down were steep and uneven, worn down by time and neglect. Each one groaned under my weight as I descended. The dim light from the overhead bulb did little to illuminate the space, casting long, eerie shadows along the walls. It felt like I had stepped into a different world, a place that was untouched, but also frozen in time. Dust settled over everything. Old boxes stacked in corners, unused furniture covered with sheets, and forgotten belongings strewn about the floor. I noticed a few things that seemed odd. An old painting, long hidden under a pile of newspapers, was leaning against the wall. The frame was cracked, and the face of the person in the painting was smudged, as though someone had tried to wipe it away. But no one had been down here to move it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I kept telling myself it was nothing. Just an old house with its quirks. As I moved deeper into the basement, I noticed something even stranger. A faint, almost imperceptible sound. It wasn't the creak of the house settling or the hum of the furnace. It was a tapping. Soft at first, like the gentle tapping of fingers against wood. I froze. I didn't know what to make of it. I walked toward the source of the noise, which seemed to come from the far corner of the room, near an old workbench. The light from the bulb above flickered, casting strange shadows over the cluttered space. The tapping continued, and I began to feel an overwhelming sense of dread. It was so quiet, so unnatural. It felt like the house was trying to communicate with me, but I couldn't understand its language. I reached the corner, and the tapping stopped abruptly. For a moment, there was complete silence. It was almost worse than the sound. I turned to leave, but before I could take a step, I felt a cold gust of air rush past me. My breath caught in my throat, and I turned around quickly, but there was nothing there. I was about to go back upstairs when I noticed something even more bizarre. A small, faint stain on the floor. At first, I thought it was just water or dust, but as I knelt down to investigate, I realized it was darker, more red than brown. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a large stain, but it was enough to make me wonder what had caused it. I touched the floor with my fingers, and it was damp, still wet. My mind raced, but I couldn't make sense of it. It didn't belong here. Nothing about it did. I bolted back upstairs, slamming the basement door behind me. My pulse was racing, and my hands shook as I leaned against the wall. I couldn't explain what had just happened. The tapping, the cold air, the stain, none of it made sense. But I couldn't ignore the growing unease in my chest. I went to my partner, who was still on the couch, scrolling through his phone. He looked up, confused as I paced in front of him. I tried to tell him what had happened, but he didn't seem to understand the urgency. "It's just an old basement," he said, rolling his eyes. "I'm sure it's nothing. Maybe it's just some old pipes making noises." But it wasn't just old pipes. I knew it, deep down. The feeling in the pit of my stomach told me it was something else. Something that had been waiting for us to notice, to make the first move. That basement, the house itself, felt alive in a way that no one could understand unless they were standing in it, feeling the weight of its history. The next day, I went back to the basement, determined to understand what was going on. But when I opened the door, everything was exactly as it had been. The painting was still there, leaning against the wall. The workbench still stood in the corner, dust gathering. The stain on the floor, gone. I checked every corner, every inch of that space. But there was nothing there. No tapping, no cold drafts, no stain. It was as if the night before had never happened. The house was silent, like it always had been. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was just waiting for me to let my guard down again. And I couldn't help but wonder, if the house could hide its secrets so well, what else was it hiding? The days after that first incident passed in a strange blur. I couldn't stop thinking about the basement, about the odd feeling it gave me, and about the stain that vanished without a trace. I told myself it was nothing more than an overactive imagination, a product of being too caught up in the eerie old house and its endless creaks. But even as I went about my daily routine, that nagging unease kept following me, like a shadow I couldn't escape. The house felt different, more oppressive, and I couldn't shake the sense that something was lurking just out of sight, something waiting for me to acknowledge it. I started noticing little things, tiny changes that didn't seem to make sense. One evening, I walked into the kitchen and noticed the cupboard doors had been left ajar. At first, I thought it was my partner. He often left the kitchen in disarray, not thinking to put things back where they belonged. But when I checked, I saw that the cans inside the cupboard were neatly arranged, as if someone had put them there with deliberate care. The doors were just left slightly open, as though they had been moved intentionally, but then forgotten. I called out to him, but again, there was no response. The house felt too still, too quiet. I stood there for a few moments, trying to make sense of it, but the more I stared at the cupboard, the more wrong it seemed. The air in the kitchen grew heavier, almost thicker, and I felt my heart rate quicken. I took a deep breath, convinced that it was just another strange quirk of the house, another small thing that was better left alone. But I couldn't shake it. Something about the cupboard, about the way the doors were left open just enough to make me notice, made my skin crawl. Later that night, as I sat in the living room, the house felt like it was closing in on me. The lights flickered on and off sporadically, casting long, haunting shadows across the walls. The ticking of the clock on the mantel grew louder, almost too loud. It became rhythmic, like the beat of a drum. At first, I thought it was just a malfunctioning bulb or a power surge, but then it happened again, and again. The light above the stairs flickered, and I noticed something strange. The shadows cast on the walls seemed to stretch and shift, as if they had a life of their own. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I was imagining it, but when I looked again, they were still there, moving just a little. It was subtle, like a ripple across the surface of water, but it was enough to make my stomach turn. I called my partner into the room, asking him to check the lights and the wiring. He came upstairs, shrugging off my concerns. "The house is old," he said, running his hand through his hair. "Things like this happen all the time." But even as he spoke, I could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house felt like it was alive, breathing with a heavy, slow rhythm that I could almost feel in the walls. The furnace, which had always been silent before, hummed loudly throughout the night, like a low growl echoing through the house. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling of dread clung to me. I kept thinking back to the basement, to the tapping and the cold air that had swept through me. Whatever was down there, whatever had been watching, was still here. The next day, I decided to go back down into the basement. I couldn't explain why, but I felt compelled to investigate. I had to know if there was something, anything, I could find that would make sense of all the strange things happening around me. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was overthinking it, but deep down, I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. As I descended the stairs, the air grew cooler, more damp. The smell of mildew and decay hung in the air, a constant reminder of the basement's age. The light flickered again, casting long, sharp shadows that seemed to stretch farther than they should. I gripped the railing tightly as I stepped down, trying to shake off the growing anxiety in my chest. The basement was exactly as I had left it, but there was something new. The old workbench in the corner had been moved. It wasn't much, just a few inches, but enough to make a difference. I walked over to it, my eyes scanning the room for anything out of place. The floor, where the stain had been, was clean, too clean. The dust that had once settled in that corner was gone, as if it had been wiped away. It didn't make sense. No one had been down here since I last checked, so how could it have changed? I turned back to the door, intending to leave, but then something caught my eye, a small object lying on the floor near the workbench. It was a key, a small, rusted key, unlike any I had seen before. I picked it up, running my fingers over the cold metal. It was old, weathered, with an intricate design carved into the handle. I couldn't explain why, but I felt like this key was important, like it was meant to be found. My heart raced as I turned it over in my hands, wondering what it might unlock. It felt heavy with a strange energy, as though it had a purpose beyond its mere existence. I looked around the room, searching for anything that might hint at what the key opened. There was an old cabinet in the corner, one that had been there since we moved in. I hadn't paid much attention to it before, but now it seemed to draw me in. The key felt like it belonged to it. Without thinking, I walked over to the cabinet and knelt down, placing the key in the lock. It fit perfectly, as though it had been waiting for this moment. I turned it, and the door creaked open with an eerie slowness. Inside, the cabinet was empty, except for a small wooden box. I pulled the box out, my hands trembling, and opened it. Inside, there was nothing but dust. But at the very bottom, I noticed something faintly shimmering. A small, delicate piece of paper, so thin and fragile that it seemed like it might disintegrate at the slightest touch. I unfolded it carefully, and my breath caught in my throat. It was a drawing, rough, almost childlike, but unmistakable. The image was of the house, drawn with eerie precision, but there was something else in the picture. A shadowy figure standing at the window, watching me. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. This was no ordinary piece of paper. Someone had drawn this, someone who had been here long before us. But why? And what did it mean? I backed away from the cabinet, the weight of the key and the drawing pressing down on me. The air felt thicker now, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to make the next move. But I couldn't stay in the basement any longer. The dread that had settled in my chest was suffocating. I rushed back upstairs, clutching the drawing and the key tightly. I didn't know what to make of it, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever was in this house, whatever had been here before us, wasn't finished yet. It was waiting, watching, and now it was my turn to face it. The tension had been building for days, and that evening, it all came to a head. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me, something I couldn't see but could sense lurking just beyond the edges of my vision. The house felt heavier, as if the walls themselves were closing in. I couldn't even bring myself to walk past the basement door anymore. Every time I passed it, I felt that cold, suffocating pull urging me to turn the handle, to descend into the dark. to finally confront whatever it was that had been silently observing me from the shadows. But I didn't have to go to the basement to confront it. It came to me. That evening, after another long day of trying to pretend everything was fine, I sat in the living room, staring at the blank TV screen. I couldn't focus on anything. My mind kept drifting back to the drawing, to the key, to the things I couldn't explain. The house felt so still, too still, and I felt a chill creep up my spine. I looked at the clock. It was almost midnight, but I hadn't heard anything from my partner in hours. He was usually home by now. I tried calling him, but the line went straight to voicemail. I was alone in the house again. Suddenly, I heard a faint sound, distant but growing louder. It was the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway outside the living room. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. No one was supposed to be here, no one but me. I stood up, my knees trembling, and moved cautiously toward the door. The footsteps were too deliberate, too measured, to be a coincidence. I held my breath, straining my ears. The sound stopped for a moment, and in the silence, I could feel the air in the room shift, like the house had taken a breath. Then I heard it again, closer this time, like someone was moving through the hallway right outside the door. My pulse quickened, and I felt an icy rush of fear crawl up my spine. I couldn't stay in here. I had to know what was happening, had to see for myself. I slowly turned the doorknob, my hand trembling as I pulled it open just a crack. The hallway outside was empty, but the air was thick with the sense that I wasn't alone. The shadows in the hallway seemed to stretch farther than they should, reaching toward me like fingers eager to pull me in. Then I saw it. At the end of the hallway, at the very top of the stairs, there was a figure, just standing there, motionless. I couldn't make out the details, but I could see enough to know that it wasn't human. It was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed too long and too thin. Its shape seemed to ripple in the dim light, as if it was constantly shifting, blurring between forms. I felt a rush of cold air hit my face, and I instinctively stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. My legs shook, and I found myself paralyzed, unable to move. The figure didn't budge, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, staring at me. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was looking at me, watching me. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The air in the hallway seemed to suck itself back into the walls, and the shadows vanished, leaving behind an eerie silence. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood frozen, staring at the empty space where the figure had been. I don't know how long I stood there, too afraid to move, too terrified to process what I had just seen. But when I finally managed to pull myself together, I rushed down the hallway, heart racing in my chest, my mind spinning with confusion and fear. The stairs were empty. The hallway was empty. There was no sign of the figure, no trace of anything that could explain what I had just witnessed. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in short, panic bursts. The weight of what I had just experienced hit me all at once, and I felt my knees give way. I collapsed onto the floor, shaking uncontrollably, my mind scrambling for some kind of explanation. But there was none. I ran to the front door, desperate to escape, to get out of the house and away from whatever was haunting me. But when I reached for the handle, something stopped me. The door wouldn't open. It was as if the house itself had locked me in. A cold, unnerving laugh echoed in my ears. Not a real laugh, but one that felt like it came from the walls themselves, as if the house was alive and mocking me. I turned around, eyes wide, and there it was, the figure again. It had appeared behind me, silently, without me hearing a thing. It was closer now, standing just a few feet away, its tall, thin frame looming over me. The air around it felt thick with dread, and I could taste the metal tang of fear in my mouth. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. I tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't move. It felt like I was stuck, trapped in place, held by some unseen force. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching me with empty, soulless eyes. And then, the worst part came, the thing that made my blood run cold. A voice, not from the figure, but from deep within the walls, spoke to me. It was a low, guttural whisper, like the house itself was talking to me, to my very soul. "You should have left when you had the chance," the voice growled, vibrating through my chest. "Now it's too late." Terror flooded me, choking off my breath. I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of the house's presence, under the weight of whatever this thing was. My chest heaved, my body shaking violently, and in that moment, I truly believed that I was going to die here. That whatever had been watching me, whatever had been lurking in the corners of the house, was finally going to claim me. But then, just as suddenly as it had all started, everything stopped. The figure vanished again, and the voice was gone. The house, for a brief moment, felt silent. I was left standing in the dark, trembling, trying to gather my shattered thoughts. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually my mind cleared, and I knew what I had to do. I couldn't stay in this house any longer. Whatever was here, whatever was haunting it, wasn't going to let me go without a fight. And I wasn't going to let it win. With every ounce of strength I had left, I turned and ran, pounding on the door until I heard the lock finally give way. The door swung open, and I bolted into the night, gasping for air, my heart racing with the realization that I had barely escaped whatever darkness had taken hold of the house. But as I ran into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure, the house, was still watching me. It wasn't over. It had just begun. The night I fled the house marked the beginning of an unsettling chapter in my life, one that I could never truly leave behind. The adrenaline from escaping still coursed through my veins, but it quickly gave way to an overwhelming sense of confusion and fear. I had thought that leaving the house, physically distancing myself from the horrors that had plagued me, would be enough to make it all stop. But I was wrong. It didn't stop. It couldn't stop. When I reached the nearest town, my mind was a whirlwind of images. The figure in the hallway, the voice in the walls, the cold, oppressive air that had followed me into every room. I tried calling my partner again, but this time I couldn't even hear the sound of the dial tone. My phone had stopped working. At first, I thought it was just the shock of the night catching up with me, but the feeling didn't fade. My reality, the very foundation of everything I knew, had been shaken to its core. I found myself pacing back and forth in the hotel room, my hands trembling as I tried to make sense of it all. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, still lurking just beyond my line of sight. The house wasn't done with me. It hadn't let me go. And that realization that the terror I had experienced wasn't just confined to the walls of that old house was the most terrifying thought of all. I didn't know where to turn, who to ask for help. The town felt foreign to me, like I didn't belong here. The normalcy of it all, the streets, the lights, the hum of the distant traffic, felt strange, almost too loud in contrast to the suffocating silence of the house. I tried to sleep, but the nightmares came. They weren't like the ones I used to have, the ones that faded as soon as I woke up. These felt real. In them, I was back in the house, trapped in the dark, unable to move as the figure closed in on me, its long limbs reaching for me. I couldn't escape, not even in my sleep. The days passed in a blur, and each one felt like it dragged me further into a descent I couldn't control. I knew I had to go back. There was no way around it. The house held something I needed to understand. I couldn't keep running, not when it felt like the house was still chasing me. But what was I supposed to do? What was the right choice in a situation where nothing made sense? After a week of restless searching, I found a local historian, someone who might know about the house and its history. I had no intention of returning to it. I was terrified, But if there was any chance of uncovering the truth, I had to know. I had to find the answers, even if it meant putting myself back in the lion's den. The historian's office was a small, cluttered room filled with dusty books and maps. I explained my situation to him, though I left out the more bizarre details. I wasn't sure how to explain the feeling of being watched, or the strange, otherworldly terror that had gripped me. He listened intently, his eyes narrowing slightly as I spoke. "Your house is part of the original settlement," he said after a long pause. "It's been standing for over a century, and it's been through several owners. Some say it was cursed, though no one really knows for sure." I felt a chill run down my spine. A curse. That was what I had feared. The house had been waiting for me all along, its dark history bound to my own in ways I couldn't understand. I asked the historian about the original owners, but he didn't know much. He handed me an old photograph of the house from the early 1900s. It looked almost identical, save for the overgrown yard and the lack of modern amenities. It was hard to focus on the picture, though the moment my eyes settled on it, I felt a pang of recognition, as if I had seen it before. But I didn't know where. The historian spoke again, his voice lowering. "There are rumors of strange occurrences in that house. People have heard things, felt things, but no one ever stays long enough to get any answers. It's like it consumes you. The house is a part of something darker, something that's been there for a long time. I couldn't get out of there fast enough." I felt a weight pressing on my chest as the room seemed to close in. I thanked him quickly, eager to escape, but he grabbed my arm before I could leave. "You're not the first," he said, his voice grave. "Many have come before you, looking for answers. They never return, or if they do, they're never the same." I didn't know what to say. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the fear creeping back, threatening to choke me once again. I left the office without another word, but the historian's warning echoed in my mind. The next morning, I couldn't stay away any longer. I returned to the house. The moment I pulled up to the property, I felt the familiar sense of dread wash over me. The house stood silent and imposing, just as it had the night I left. Nothing had changed. Or had it? It was as if time had stood still. The front door was ajar, creaking softly in the wind, inviting me inside. But there was no turning back. I had come for answers, and I was going to get them, no matter the cost. I stepped inside, the air thick with the same staleness I remembered, the same chill crawling across my skin. I hesitated for a moment, then walked down the hallway, each step echoing in the silence. The shadows were deeper than before, as if they were reaching for me. And then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like someone whispering my name. I froze. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but I knew, deep down, that it wasn't my imagination. I forced myself to keep moving, to ignore the cold fear clawing in my chest. The basement door loomed ahead. I couldn't avoid it any longer. I had to know what was down there. With a shaking hand, I turned the handle. The basement stairs creaked beneath my weight as I descended, my heart thudding in my ears. The darkness was oppressive, suffocating, and the air smelled of damp earth and something more, a faint, rotten scent that made my stomach churn. I stepped into the basement, my flashlight trembling in my hand, its beam cutting through the inky blackness. And then I saw it. At the far end of the basement, there was a wooden crate. It was old, ancient even, its surface covered in dust and cobwebs. But that wasn't what caught my attention. No, it was the faint glow coming from within, an eerie light that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. I approached the crate cautiously, my breath catching in my throat. The moment I touched it, the light flickered, and I felt something cold, something ancient, reach out from within. I knew, with a certainty that made my blood run cold, that whatever this was, it was the source of everything that had happened, the whispers, the footsteps, the figure. This was the heart of it all. I pried the crate open with shaking hands, and what I found inside was far worse than anything I had imagined. There, resting on a bed of old cloth, was an ancient key, its surface intricately carved, glowing with a strange, otherworldly light. And beneath it, a series of symbols, etched into the wood itself, as if they were part of a ritual, part of a binding. In that moment, I realized the truth. The house wasn't just haunted. It was a vessel, a prison, and I had been its unwilling occupant. Whatever had been watching me, whatever had been waiting for me, had been trapped here for generations, and I had unknowingly set it free. As I stood there, staring at the key, I heard the footsteps again, closer this time, more deliberate. The figure, that same tall, shifting shadow, appeared in the doorway, its limbs stretching toward me, its empty eyes fixed on mine. And I knew, with chilling certainty, that there was no escaping it now. The key, the object that had been the source of everything, still weighed heavy in my hands as I stood frozen in the basement. I didn't know whether to throw it away, to burn it, or to do anything that could sever the tie it had formed between me and the house. But no matter what I tried, it didn't matter. The house had already marked me. The figure in the doorway wasn't moving anymore, but its presence felt as tangible as ever. Its features were indiscernible in the dark, its long arms unnaturally stretched, and yet its face, if you could even call it that, seemed to hover, a vacant space where features should have been. My blood ran cold, and my instincts screamed at me to run, to leave this cursed place behind, but there was no place to run. There was no escape. My heart hammered in my chest as I backed away from the crate, feeling the cold air closing in, thick with that familiar dread. Every step felt like a choice, every movement like it would push me closer to a fate I couldn't control. The house was alive with a kind of malevolent intent, its very walls pulsating with the knowledge that I had uncovered something I shouldn't have. The footsteps behind me grew louder, echoing in the confines of the basement. I couldn't run fast enough, couldn't outrun the pull of the house. The figure inched closer, and in a moment of desperation, I stumbled forward, knocking the crate over. The key, rolled across the floor, clinking faintly as it came to a stop by the far wall. The light that had once illuminated the basement flickered and dimmed, as if the house was drawing in its power. And then, in the silence that followed, everything seemed to shift. The temperature dropped. The air grew heavier. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move, to breathe, and I realized, too late, that the house wasn't just a place. It wasn't just an object or structure. It was alive. It had been waiting for something, someone, and now that it had me, it would never let go. I don't know how long I stood there, unable to tear my eyes away from the shifting darkness, unable to move. The presence of the figure in the doorway wasn't just physical, it was mental, spiritual, an oppressive weight that filled every inch of the room. It was the house, yes, but it was something older, something darker, more ancient than anything I could comprehend. And then, as if by some unspoken signal, the floor beneath me groaned. The house shifted. I gasped as the walls seemed to tremble, the old beams above cracking, splintering as the house seemed to react to my discovery. It wasn't just haunted, it was cursed. And somehow I had become its next victim. The air around me thickened as I felt the oppressive weight of the house pulling me, as if the floor itself was reaching up to grab me. I stumbled back, my heart racing, my legs refusing to cooperate. But before I could even take a full step away, the figure lunged. It was so quick, so sudden, that I didn't have time to react. Its cold, unyielding grip wrapped around my wrist, its touch freezing. I screamed, a raw, desperate sound, but it was swallowed by the darkness, consumed by the house that had claimed me. The thing, whatever it was, pulled me forward, its fingers digging into my skin, the air around me growing colder with every movement. I fought, tried to break free, but the figure's hold was relentless. The house, no, it wasn't just the house anymore. It was holding me. The walls pressed in closer, the shadows surrounding me, swallowing me whole. The closer I came to the figure, the more I felt the weight of the curse, the weight of the centuries of sorrow and malice that had been locked away, waiting for the right moment. And now that I was here, it seemed the house was ready to claim me in full. And then everything stopped. The figure let go. The house stilled. I gasped for air, my body shaking, but I didn't know what had happened. I was back in the basement, yes, but the room was no longer oppressive. The dark shadows were still there, but the figure was gone. The cold was still there, but it wasn't the same. The air felt lighter, and the key, it was still on the floor, but it had stopped glowing. It was just an ordinary, rusted piece of metal again. My heart was still pounding in my chest, but my mind couldn't make sense of what had just transpired. Had it been real? Had the house truly been alive? Or had it all been some twisted figment of my imagination? My body was bruised, my wrist still aching from the figure's grip, but the atmosphere in the house felt different. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the key, before the overwhelming urge to leave overtook me. I couldn't stay there, not anymore. The house had done something to me. I could feel it in my bones, in my skin, a weight that would never be shaken off. Whatever it was, it had marked me. No matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, I would never be free. I didn't look back as I left the basement, didn't stop to wonder what lay behind me. All I knew was that I couldn't stay another moment. I grabbed my bag, threw it over my shoulder, and I left the house without a second thought. The front door slammed shut behind me, the noise echoing through the empty house, but I didn't hear anything more. I didn't care. I never went back. The next few days were a blur of confusion and fear. I stayed at a nearby motel, never speaking to anyone, never telling anyone what had happened. The house was still there, sitting in the distance, looming as a reminder of everything I had experienced. But it was as if I had been erased from its history, gone from its walls, forgotten by its shadows. But I know better now. The house may have stopped haunting me physically, but the feeling of its presence still lingers, creeping at the edges of my mind. The fear doesn't go away. The memories of the figure, the whispers, the key, they're etched into my memory, like scars that will never fade. I don't know if I was just unlucky, or if I was meant to be the next victim in a long line of others, but I do know one thing. Some houses are more than just structures. Some houses hold more than just the echoes of their past. And once they've claimed you, once they've drawn you in, there's no escaping. You'll never truly leave. You'll just keep looking over your shoulder, wondering if the house is still out there, waiting for the next person to wander into its grasp. And you'll wonder, every day, if it's coming for you again. Maybe it already has. It was supposed to be the perfect project. I had been looking for a new challenge, something that would help me reset after a long period of life's typical grind. You know, that phase where everything feels monotonous and dull. I was eager for something to pull me out of that rut. So, when the opportunity came to buy an old Victorian house in a quiet part of town, I jumped at it without hesitation. It wasn't just the fact that it was affordable for its size. It had history, character, and most importantly, the chance to turn it into something special. I could feel the weight of its past as I walked through the creaky halls, each step echoing through the nearly empty rooms. There was an unspoken promise in the air, as if the house itself was whispering, "Bring me back to life." It was just me at the time, and a couple of my close friends agreed to help with the renovation. We were excited about the project, thrilled at the thought of turning this old, forgotten house into something modern, comfortable, and hopefully profitable. The house had been abandoned for nearly 15 years, and most people in the town thought it was beyond saving. The previous owner had been an older woman who passed away quietly in the upstairs bedroom, leaving the house to wither. From what I gathered, no one was ever really interested in taking it on. It was too old, too far gone, they said. I didn't care about any of that though. I was looking for something with character, and this place oozed it. The dark wood paneling, the antique fireplaces, the high ceilings, all of it just spoke to me. It was as though it had a story to tell, and I was ready to listen. It was just the four of us working there in the beginning. Me, my old friend Jake, his younger brother Mark, and a guy I'd met online, Tom, who seemed to know his way around old houses. We worked hard, tearing down walls, scraping up old linoleum, and uncovering more layers of the house's history than I had ever anticipated. The whole place was like a maze. Every time we thought we'd seen everything, there was another hidden door, a forgotten staircase, a dusty corner full of memories long past. The first few days went by smoothly. There was nothing too strange, just the usual mess of renovation work. We stayed late into the evenings, just as the sun would dip behind the horizon, painting the house in eerie shadows. I remember the smell of the old timber, the heavy dust in the air, and the constant hum of the old furnace system. The house felt cold at night, even with all of us working inside. It wasn't an unnatural cold, but one that seemed to seep into your bones. The kind of cold that made you want to turn up the heat, but somehow left you uncomfortable, like the house itself was fighting against it. At first, the work was the usual sort of thing you'd expect from a renovation. We were replacing the electrical wiring, pulling up flooring, patching up drywall. The house seemed to be holding together better than we expected, and we were all in good spirits, cracking jokes and sharing stories from our past. It felt normal, like any other home renovation project you might see on TV. But then came the first odd thing, something that would stay with me for the rest of the project. I was alone in the upstairs hallway, trying to figure out why one of the light fixtures wasn't working. I had my hands full with the tools they'd brought up, trying to avoid the mess of wires that seemed to be tangled up everywhere. The house was quiet, aside from the sound of my footsteps and the occasional squeak of the floorboards beneath me. It was around 9 p.m., just as the last bit of light was fading from the sky. The only light in the hallway came from the dim bulb above me. I was standing in front of one of the old wooden doors that had long been shut. I don't know why I decided to open it. Maybe it was the curiosity that comes with renovation, always wondering what's behind the walls and the hidden spaces of a house that's been untouched for so long. The door creaked loudly as I turned the handle, almost as though it had been waiting to be opened. Inside was a room I hadn't seen before. It'd been through the entire upstairs several times, but this room had been hidden behind a wall. There was no reason it should have been there. The wall seemed solid when we first checked. It was a small, cramped space with nothing but dust and forgotten furniture inside. I noticed a chair by the window, covered in a heavy layer of dust, but what caught my attention was the window itself. The glass was cracked, the paint peeling away in thin strips. I stepped closer, squinting through the grime, but what I saw out the window stopped me dead in my tracks. It wasn't a view of the street like I had expected. Instead, it was a thick, foggy mist, almost like a dream. I could see nothing beyond it. I know it sounds ridiculous, but it was almost as if the mist was moving, flowing across the glass. I blinked a few times, trying to clear my vision, but when I looked again, the mist was gone. Shaking my head, I stepped back and closed the door, deciding it was time for a break. But something didn't sit right with me. It was the first sign that this house wasn't as ordinary as I had thought. Something about that room, that view, felt off. I brushed it off at the time, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild, but the doubt stayed with me. And that doubt would grow, day by day, as we dug deeper into the house's history, uncovering more than we had bargained for. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying what I had seen in my mind, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about that room. Something I couldn't quite explain. I had only opened that door because I thought I was ready to take on the house's secrets. But now, it seemed, the house was showing me that some things are better left locked away. The next morning, I woke up feeling unusually tired. It wasn't just from the late night of work, though that had contributed. No, there was something else nagging at me, a sense of unease that I couldn't shake off. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just a side effect of an exhausting week. But the feeling lingered, like a shadow following me wherever I went. I had already made plans to meet up with Tom and Mark that day. We had agreed to focus on the kitchen, which needed the most work. The floor was warped, and the cabinets were falling apart. It was clear the kitchen was one of the most neglected parts of the house. The moment I walked into the kitchen, I felt it again, the cold. It was subtle, like a faint draft that you notice only when you're still for a moment. It wasn't coming from any window, and the heat was turned up full blast. There shouldn't have been any cold air, yet it was there, persistent and oddly familiar. "Hey, do you feel that?" I asked Tom, who was already pulling off the old cabinet doors. Tom didn't seem to notice at first, but Mark, who had been scrubbing the floor in the corner, looked up and nodded. "Yeah, it's a little chilly in here. It's not just me, right?" I glanced over at the window, thinking maybe there was a draft coming from the loose frame, but it was closed tightly. Everything looked normal. "I don't know, maybe we just need to adjust the thermostat," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I felt a knot form in my stomach. Something about the way the air moved in that room just didn't sit right with me. We continued working, but the strange coldness didn't go away. It stayed in the kitchen, lingering around us, as though the house was trying to make its presence known. Tom eventually shrugged it off, but I couldn't. I kept thinking about that hidden room upstairs. What had I seen through the cracked window? And why had I felt so uneasy there? Later that afternoon, after we had finished most of the work in the kitchen, I decided to investigate that room upstairs again. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was looking for something to explain away the feeling I couldn't shake. But the truth was, I had to know. I walked up the stairs and into the hallway, the same one where I'd found the hidden door. The door was still there, closed tightly. I felt a strange mix of excitement and hesitation, but this time I didn't hesitate. I turned the knob and stepped into the room. It was just as I had left it. The dust was thick on the floor, and the furniture was all still in place. The chair by the window, the broken glass, nothing had changed. But there was something different about the atmosphere in the room now. The air felt heavier, almost suffocating. The feeling of being watched was so intense that I had to force myself to breathe steadily. I walked over to the window again, but the foggy mist was gone. The view looked the same as it had before, just the quiet streets of the neighborhood. But as I stood there, staring out, something caught my eye. There was a figure standing at the edge of the yard, near the trees. A shadow, barely visible, yet unmistakably there. My heart raced. I strained my eyes, trying to make out who or what it was, but the figure didn't move. It was as though it was waiting for me to notice, almost daring me to approach. My legs felt weak, and for a moment, I thought I might faint. I quickly turned away from the window and walked out of the room, my breath shallow, my mind racing. What had I just seen? I wasn't sure if it had been real or just a trick of the light, but I couldn't ignore the cold rush that ran through me when it looked out the window. I descended the stairs quickly and found Mark and Tom still working in the kitchen. "Hey, are you guys messing with the thermostat?" I asked, trying to sound casual. They both looked at me, confused. "No, why?" Mark asked, wiping his hands on a rag. "Because the upstairs room is freezing," I replied, my voice coming out a little sharper than I intended. Tom raised an eyebrow, clearly uninterested. "Probably just an old house thing. There's nothing weird about it. These old places don't have insulation like the newer homes. Just a draft." I nodded, but I wasn't convinced. It wasn't just a draft. It was something else entirely. As the day went on, the feeling of unease only grew. Every time I walked through the hallway, I couldn't help but glance toward that door. Something about it felt like it was calling me, like it wanted me to return. I tried to stay busy with the renovation work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching me, that it was aware of my every movement. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every creak of the house made me jump. Every gust of wind outside seemed louder than usual. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps walking through the hallway outside my door. I froze, listening intently, but the sound stopped. I waited a few more minutes, holding my breath, but nothing came. I chalked it up to the house settling, or maybe the wind shifting through the old beams. But when I tried to sleep again, the footsteps returned, slow and deliberate, like someone was pacing outside my door. By this point, I was too afraid to check. I couldn't bring myself to open the door, to step out into the dark hallway. The fear that had taken root in my chest was too strong. I lay there, wide awake, listening to the sounds of the house as if it were alive, alive in ways I couldn't explain. The next day, we all gathered for a quick meeting to discuss our progress. Everyone was still in good spirits, but I could see it in their eyes, the same unease I was feeling. Mark mentioned that he thought he saw something strange in the corner of the attic, something he couldn't quite describe. Tom had a similar experience in the basement, where he swore he had seen something move out of the corner of his eye. But what struck me most was Jake. He hadn't said anything about his experience, but I could see it in his face. He was just as shaken as the rest of us. I didn't bring up the shadow in the yard or the footsteps it heard. Part of me wondered if I was just overthinking it. But there was a growing sense that we were all starting to feel it, whatever it was. Something was wrong with the house. And as we continued to dig deeper, I couldn't help but wonder if we were digging up something that should have stayed buried. That night, I tried to focus on getting some sleep. But it wasn't long before I heard it again. The footsteps, slower this time, echoing through the hallway, closer to my door. I held my breath, and this time, I didn't wait. I opened the door. The hallway was empty, completely silent. But the cold was back. It was stronger now, almost unbearable. The house had a secret, and it wasn't ready to let me go. The air inside the house had grown thick with tension. Each day felt heavier than the last, and every time I walked down the narrow, creaky hallways, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. It wasn't just the cold anymore. It was a constant presence, something I couldn't explain, something that seemed to grow stronger with each passing hour. We continued working on the renovation, but it was clear that none of us were really focused on it anymore. Every time we picked up a tool or moved a piece of furniture, we were hyper-aware of every creak and groan of the house, of every shift in the air around us. It felt as though the house itself was alive, breathing in sync with our every move. It started small. At first, it was the little things. Doors that didn't stay closed, tools that disappeared and reappeared in different spots, light bulbs flickering at odd times. We laughed it off at first, chalking it up to old wiring and a house that was simply settling. But after a while, the oddities became harder to ignore. One afternoon, I was working in the attic alone, trying to sort through some of the old boxes that had been left behind by the previous owners. The attic was dim, and the only light came from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. The air up there was thick with dust, and every step I took seemed to disturb the stillness. I could feel my skin prickling as I sifted through the old belongings. It wasn't just the isolation of the attic that made me uneasy. It was the feeling that I wasn't alone. Suddenly, I heard it, a soft sound, like a whisper. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, or perhaps the wind whistling through a crack in the walls. But then I heard it again, a faint, unmistakable voice. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice was too soft to make out the words, but the tone was clear, almost pleading. I looked around, my eyes scanning the attic, but there was no one there. The silence returned, thick and suffocating. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it clung to me like a weight, pressing down on my chest. I stood there for a long time, staring into the dim corners of the attic, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing did. I quickly gathered the rest of the boxes and went back downstairs, my hands trembling. I told myself I had just imagined it. The house was old after all. But as I descended into the hallway, the sensation of being watched crept back in. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. It was an undeniable presence. That night, things escalated even further. I was lying in bed, trying to get some rest, when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoing down the hallway, just outside my door. My heart skipped a beat as I sat up, listening intently. The footsteps stopped, and I held my breath, waiting for something to happen. Seconds turned into minutes, but nothing came. I cautiously got out of bed, my bare feet touching the cold wooden floor. I stood still, listening for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, no footsteps, no sounds of movement. Just the stillness of the house. I opened the door, stepping into the dark hallway, and looked around. The floorboards creaked beneath my weight, and the faint smell of musty air filled my nostrils. The hallway was empty, but the cold was back, stronger than before. I closed the door and locked it, but the chill in the air didn't go away. It lingered, creeping under the cracks in the door, seeping through the walls. I could feel it pressing in on me, and no matter how tightly I pulled the covers over my head, I couldn't shake it. The next day, I decided to confront it head on. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was normal. There was something wrong with this house, and I needed to know what it was. I gathered Tom and Mark together and told them what had been happening. I didn't hold anything back. I told them about the voices, the footsteps, the coldness, and the strange sensations that had been growing stronger by the day. They listened quietly, their faces a mix of concern and disbelief. "Maybe we should just call someone," Tom suggested, his voice tense. "I mean, this isn't normal. It's not just some weird house stuff anymore." "I don't know," I said, shaking my head. "I don't want to jump to conclusions. But something is off. We need to figure out what's going on before we make any rash decisions." We decided to start by exploring the hidden rooms in the house. I had already found one of them, the room behind the door in the upstairs hallway, but there were more. The house was old, and there were parts of it that had clearly been sealed off over the years. We needed to get into those spaces and see what was hidden. We began with the basement. The basement was dimly lit, with only a few weak light bulbs hanging from the ceiling. The air down there was thick with dust and mildew. and the smell of damp wood filled my nostrils as we descended the creaky stairs. We had to duck under low beams as we moved further into the room, our footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. At first, everything seemed normal. There were old boxes stacked in the corners, shelves filled with forgotten tools, and a few pieces of furniture that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. But as I moved deeper into the room, I noticed something strange. There was a section of the wall that didn't quite match the rest of the room. It was as if the brickwork had been patched over with something. A strange feeling washed over me as I walked closer. The air seemed to shift, and I could feel a cold draft coming from the wall. "Guys, check this out," I called to Tom and Mark. They came over, and we all stared at the wall. It wasn't like the rest of the room. It was slightly different, as though it had been added much later. There was something off about the way the mortar had been applied. It didn't look old, and there were faint marks on the wall that almost resembled scratches. "What do you think this is?" Mark asked, his voice low. "I don't know, but it looks like someone sealed it off for a reason," I replied. "Let's see if we can break through." We spent the next hour trying to break through the wall, using whatever tools we could find. It wasn't easy. The wall was solid, and it took a lot of effort to even make a dent. But eventually, after what felt like an eternity, we broke through. The dust and debris flew into the air as the wall cracked open, revealing a hidden chamber behind it. The room was small, but there was something about it that immediately made me feel uneasy. It was empty, except for a small wooden box sitting in the center of the floor. The box looked old, ancient, even, and it was covered in strange symbols I didn't recognize. We all stood there for a moment, staring at it, unsure of what to do next. But something pulled me toward it. I stepped forward, my hand shaking as I reached for the box. Before I could touch it, there was a loud bang from behind us. We all spun around, but there was nothing there. The room was silent again, except for the sound of our breathing. "Did you hear that?" Tom asked, his voice tight with fear. "I heard it," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't take my eyes off the box. It was like it was calling to me, urging me to open it. But I knew that if I did, things would never be the same. Something was waiting for us, and we had just opened the door. The room was colder than ever, the air thick with an oppressive weight that seemed to press down on us. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, each beat a deafening sound in the silence that had settled over us. Tom and Mark stood frozen beside me, their faces pale, eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and terror. We had just broken through the wall, revealing the hidden room and that strange old wooden box. And now it felt like the house was alive. Alive in a way that we couldn't understand, that we couldn't control. The unsettling presence we had all been sensing for weeks now seemed to have intensified, the atmosphere in the house pressing against us like an invisible force, suffocating and relentless. I reached for the box, my hand trembling as I inched closer, unable to stop myself. The symbols carved into its surface were like nothing he'd ever seen before, their patterns twisting in ways that made my head ache when I focused on them for too long. The air around it felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but every fiber of my being screamed at me to stop, to turn and run as far away as I could. But I couldn't. Not now. We had come too far. Mark spoke up, his voice strained. "What do you think's inside it?" His words were barely a whisper, but they cut through the tension in the room, snapping us out of our trance-like state. "I don't know," I muttered, but the words didn't sound like they belonged to me. My voice was hollow, as though someone else was speaking through me. "But we have to find out." The closer my fingers got to the box, the more intense the sensation became. It was as though the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. My pulse quickened as I finally touched the box, the wood colder than it should have been, sending a jolt of icy shock through my fingertips. Suddenly, the box jerked under my touch, as though it had come to life on its own. The entire room seemed to shudder, the walls groaning under the strain. The temperature dropped even further, and I could see my breath in the air. But it wasn't just the cold, it was something else, something much darker. It was as though the house was fighting back, warning us to leave, to stop meddling with things we didn't understand. Before I could pull my hand away, the lid of the box snapped open with a sharp, ear-piercing crack. A blinding light exploded from within, so intense that I had to shield my eyes, instinctively stepping back, but it was too late. The light engulfed the entire room. I could hear Tom and Mark shouting, their voices distant and muffled, like they were underwater. The light was overwhelming, burning through my retinas, and for a moment, I thought I might pass out from the sheer intensity of it. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light vanished. The room plunged into darkness. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and panicked, my heart pounding in my ears. But I wasn't alone. A voice, deep and low, reverberated through the room, so powerful that it seemed to come from every direction at once. "Why did you wake me?" The voice wasn't like anything I had ever heard before. It was otherworldly, ancient, filled with a malice I couldn't describe. It made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, the chill in the air thickening into something far worse. I stumbled back, my legs unsteady as panic gripped me. "What is this?" I gasped, my voice trembling. The air grew heavier, suffocating, and I felt a cold hand brush against my face. But when I opened my eyes, no one was there. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, but nothing made sense. The house was alive with something evil, something that had been waiting for us to unlock it. Tom's voice broke through the panic, frantic and panicked. "We need to get out of here. Now," he screamed. But it was too late. The house had already decided that we weren't going anywhere. Suddenly, the walls around us began to shift, groaning under the weight of something massive, something ancient. The floorboards creaked and cracked beneath our feet, as though the house itself was alive, shifting and rearranging to trap us inside. We tried to run, but every direction we turned seemed to bring us back to the same spot. The hallways stretched on endlessly, the doors disappearing and reappearing, taunting us with the promise of escape. But no matter how hard we tried, we couldn't escape. It was as if the house had become a maze, a prison from which there was no escape. "Help!" Mark screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the oppressive darkness that now surrounded us. I could feel the presence growing stronger, surrounding us, pressing in from every direction. The air was thick with the stench of decay and rot. The walls seemed to close in on us, the ceiling descending as though the house itself was trying to crush us under its weight. We couldn't breathe. We couldn't see. We couldn't think. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. A figure. A shadow, moving impossibly fast through the darkness. It was tall, impossibly tall, its shape shifting and contorting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel its eyes on me. It was watching me. And then the whispering began. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, filling my mind with a voice that wasn't mine. A voice that wasn't even human. It called to me, urging me to come closer, to surrender. Come to me." The words were like poison, slipping into my thoughts, clouding my judgment. The figure in the shadows stepped closer, its form becoming clearer, and I could see it now. It wasn't human. It was something else. Something twisted and ancient, with eyes that glowed an unnatural, sickly green. Its face was gaunt, its features barely recognizable, like something that had been buried for centuries, waiting to rise. I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. The figure took another step forward, its long, bony fingers reaching out to me. And then everything went black. The blackness was suffocating. My body felt heavy, as though gravity itself had turned against me, pinning me to the floor. I couldn't move. My eyes were wide open, but all I could see was the void, the same dark, oppressive void that seemed to stretch on forever. For a moment, I thought I might be dead, trapped in some kind of nightmare that I couldn't escape from. But then I heard it, the sound of breathing. Slow, labored breaths, as though someone or something was struggling for air. It took me a few seconds to realize that the sound was coming from me. I was still alive. I tried to move, but my limbs felt numb, unresponsive, as though they no longer belonged to me. Panic started to rise in my chest again. I needed to get out. I needed to escape. And then, as if the world was slowly coming back into focus, I heard voices, faint but unmistakable. Tom, Mark. They were still here, still alive. Tom? I managed to croak, my voice barely audible in the silence that surrounded us. My throat was dry, raw, but I had to know if they were okay. If any of us were. Here, Tom's voice responded, weak but steady. I'm here. I could hear him struggling to stand up, and then Mark's voice joined in, both of them calling to each other in the same panicked, desperate tone. I tried to push myself to my feet, but it was like the weight of the air around me was too much to bear. It felt like I was drowning. Mark, I shouted, finally forcing myself to sit up, though my head was spinning from the sudden movement. What the hell just happened? I could hear Mark's ragged breathing as he crawled toward me. I don't know, he replied, his voice shaky. I don't know what that thing was. But we're still alive. We have to get out of here. I could hear Tom grunting as he stood, his footsteps unsteady but determined. We need to get out now, before it comes back. We all managed to stand, though it felt like we were walking on uneven ground, our bodies still disoriented from whatever force had gripped us moments before. It was like the air itself had become solid, pressing down on us from all sides, a suffocating reminder of the nightmare we had just survived. As we stumbled down the dark hallway, the house seemed different, changed. It was as though the walls themselves had absorbed the horrors we had experienced, and now the very structure was alive with the echoes of the evil we had unleashed. I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that twisted, monstrous figure from the shadows creeping up behind us, its glowing eyes burning into my soul. But there was nothing, just the silence. The house was eerily quiet now, too quiet, as though everything had gone still in the aftermath of the chaos. We reached the door to the outside, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread wash over me. What if it wasn't over? What if the house had a way of pulling us back in, of trapping us in some twisted version of reality where we were never meant to leave? Tom reached for the door handle, his hand trembling as he pulled it open. The cold air hit us like a wave, sharp and refreshing after the stifling heat that had clung to the house. We stepped outside one by one into the night, our legs shaky beneath us. We didn't say anything. We didn't need to. We had all felt it, the unspoken weight of what we had just endured, what we had uncovered. There were no words to describe it, no way to make sense of what had happened. As we stood there in the cold night air, trying to collect ourselves, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't truly escaped. The house was still out there, waiting. It had been built on something dark, something ancient, and I didn't know if that evil would ever let us go. We stood in the yard for what felt like hours, the night stretching out before us. Finally, Tom spoke, breaking the silence that had fallen over us. We can't stay here, he said, his voice low and steady. We need to leave. For good. I nodded, agreeing with him, though the words felt hollow. We could leave, but the memories of what we had seen, what we had uncovered, would haunt us forever. That house, that place, it had marked us, changed us. And no matter where we went, no matter how far we ran, it would never truly be behind us. We got into our cars without speaking again, the weight of the night hanging heavy over us. I don't know how far we drove or how long we were on the road. All I could think about was the house, the darkness, the things we had unlocked and unleashed. By the time we reached the nearest town, I could see that Mark and Tom were just as shaken as I was. We didn't talk much, didn't speak of what had happened in the house. It didn't matter. Nothing would ever be the same again. We parted ways without another word, each of us retreating into our own separate lives, though I knew none of us would ever truly escape the memories. The house was still there. It always would be. And I don't know if it was because we had unleashed something we weren't meant to, or if it was simply because the house itself was alive with darkness. But I knew one thing for certain. None of us would ever forget what happened there. We had resolved to leave, to run, to survive. But what we had uncovered, what we had felt in those final moments, had forever changed us. And as I look back now, I wonder if the house ever truly lets go of those who enter. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it waits. Maybe it knows that sooner or later we'll all come back. Because some places, some dark, twisted places, never really let go. We never talked about that house again. Not in any meaningful way. We didn't need to. The memories were still fresh, hanging over us like a cloud that refused to dissipate. It was the kind of thing you could never really forget, no matter how far you tried to run from it. The house had imprinted itself on our minds, a permanent scar that we carried with us wherever we went. For months, I couldn't sleep without seeing those eyes. The eyes of whatever had been waiting for us in the shadows, hidden in the walls, the floors, woven into the very fabric of that place. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear its breathing, slow and steady, like a death knell waiting to strike. It was like the house had left a piece of itself with me, a dark, lingering presence that no amount of time could erase. Tom, Mark, and I tried to go back to our lives. It was easier for them. They had families to return to, routines to get back into. But for me, the world felt different. I could never quite shake the feeling that something was watching me, that something was waiting for me to slip up, to come back to that place. And though I did my best to keep living, to keep moving forward, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the past pressing in on me. I went to therapy. I tried to talk about it, about the house, about the terror we had experienced, but the words never felt right. The doctors couldn't understand. How could they? What had happened to us wasn't something that could be explained away by science or reason. It wasn't something that could be fixed by talking. It was something that had changed us, something that had carved its mark into our souls. Over time, I moved to a new city. I got a new job. I tried to build a new life, one far removed from the nightmare we had endured. But no matter where I went, the feeling of being followed never quite left me. It was as if the house had taken a part of me with it, a part that I would never get back. No matter how far I ran, no matter how hard I tried to outrun the memories, I could feel that darkness pulling at me. Years passed. Life went on. But then, one evening, I received a message. It was from Mark. His words were simple, but they carried a weight that I could feel across the miles between us. I went back. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, my chest tightening as though something cold had gripped me from the inside out. Mark had gone back. After all we had been through, after everything that house had put us through, he continued. I don't know why. I thought I could face it, but I was wrong. It's still there. It's still watching. I think I made a mistake. The words echoed in my mind, sending a chill down my spine. I wanted to tell him not to go back, to leave it all behind, but I knew deep down that it was too late. Once you've crossed a line like that, once you've uncovered something you weren't meant to see, you can never truly leave. That house, that thing, it was never going to let us go. I called Mark immediately, my hands trembling as I picked up the phone. I needed to hear his voice to make sure he was okay. But the phone rang and rang, unanswered. I didn't hear from him again. Days passed. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened. I reached out to Tom, but he didn't pick up either. I drove to the house, driven by a need to know, to understand what had happened, to make sure they hadn't disappeared into that same darkness that had swallowed us whole. When I arrived, the house was exactly as I remembered it, just as it had been that night, that horrible night. It looked abandoned, but there was something more about it now. Something ominous, like it was waiting for me to step inside, waiting for me to open the door again. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. I don't know what happened to Mark or to Tom, but I know this. Whatever that house held, whatever evil was buried within it, it wasn't finished with us. It was still there, still reaching out, still hungry. And I wonder, as I sit here in my new life, in a new city, if it'll ever truly escape it. If any of us will. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, when I'm alone and the world falls silent, I can almost feel the house calling to me. The walls whispering, the floorboards creaking, the air growing heavy with the weight of all the things left unsaid, all the things left undone. And in those moments, I realize that the house is never truly gone. It's always there, just beneath the surface, waiting for the next person to open the door. Maybe one day, someone else will hear it. Maybe one day, someone else will go inside. And when they do, I hope they'll remember us. I hope they'll remember what we went through, what we uncovered, and how we couldn't leave. Because once the house has your soul, it doesn't let go. Not ever. It all started in the spring of 2012 when I was working at an old, rundown industrial plant. The kind of place you'd expect to see in a horror movie, massive, hollow buildings that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky, surrounded by rusted fences and piles of discarded machinery. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was a job just like any other. I'd clock in at 8 a.m., work until 5 p.m., and repeat the cycle the next day. The hours blurred together, and honestly, I couldn't have cared less about the place. I was just another cog in the wheel, and I thought that would be my life. No questions, no complications. I worked the night shift with a few others. We didn't speak much, mostly kept to ourselves, but we got along well enough. The crew was made up of older guys who had been around for years and knew the ins and outs of the plant. They were a tough bunch, but there was something comforting about their routine. You knew where everyone would be, what they'd be doing, and when. The predictable rhythm of the plant's machines was like a background hum to my life. It was almost like being in a prison, but it was a prison of your own making, where the monotony kept your mind in a steady state. One of the older guys, Rick, was the most experienced of us all. He'd been working at the plant for decades, longer than anyone else, and knew the place like the back of his hand. Rick was a gruff man, with a thick beard and hands roughened by years of work. He never talked much, but when he did, everyone listened. We used to joke about how he seemed to know every inch of the plant, as if he'd lived there his whole life. To be honest, I had always thought he was a bit of a relic, a man out of time who never moved forward with the rest of the world. And yet, despite the routine, I found myself growing more uncomfortable with the place as the days went on. It was hard to pinpoint what exactly felt off, but there was something about the building, the cold, oppressive walls, the damp smell that always lingered in the air, the flickering lights that never seemed to fully stabilize. It was a feeling that stuck with you, something you couldn't shake. But at the time, I chalked it up to the dullness of working in a dead-end factory. I'll never forget the way I felt when I first set foot inside the plant. It wasn't just the dust in the air or the echoing clank of machinery, it was something more. Something deeper. But I didn't want to overthink it. I couldn't afford to. I needed the paycheck. The other guys seemed unbothered by the place, which made me feel even more foolish for feeling uneasy. They were used to the noises, the shadows, and the strange creaks of the building at night. But I wasn't. Not yet, anyway. We were tasked with cleaning up the production floor and maintaining some of the machines. Nothing special. But as I moved through the space, I started noticing things that didn't sit right with me. Small things, like the way some of the machines would shut off on their own, or how sometimes the doors to the supply room would be slightly ajar, as if someone had just been through, even when we were alone. At first, I shrugged it off. This was an old plant, after all. There were bound to be technical issues, malfunctioning equipment, and things that seemed a little odd. But deep down, something gnawed at me, something that kept me on edge. I would find myself looking over my shoulder more often than usual, hearing footsteps behind me when I was alone, and occasionally catching glimpses of shadowy figures in my peripheral vision. And yet, no one else seemed to notice. It was during one of these late shifts that I first saw it. Something I couldn't explain. But we'll get to that in a moment. This was my life now. The clang of metal, the hum of machinery, and the unnerving silence of an old factory that had seen better days. At first, it was just a way to pass the time and get by. But looking back, I wish I had listened to that nagging feeling from the start. Maybe things would have been different. The unsettling sensation I had during those first few weeks only grew with time, and it's the reason I'm telling you this story now. There was something strange about that place, something I couldn't ignore. The first real sign that something was wrong happened a few weeks after I started working there. It was around 2 a.m., and I was tasked with checking on one of the old assembly lines. It was located in the farthest part of the building, near the back exit, which was never used. It was always cold back there, colder than the rest of the plant, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. But I had a job to do, so I pushed forward. I was walking along the dimly lit corridor when I noticed something strange. The sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was one of the other guys, maybe Rick, coming to check on the line. But as I turned the corner, there was no one, just the usual emptiness. The footsteps stopped abruptly, as if whoever had been walking had vanished into thin air. I shrugged it off and continued my work. I checked the assembly line. Everything seemed fine, but as I turned to leave, I heard the sound again. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. This time, closer. I froze. I was sure I wasn't alone anymore, but there was no one there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I wasn't one to get spooked easily, but in that moment, I couldn't ignore it. The air felt heavier. The space seemed colder. It was as if something was watching me. I stood there for a moment, listening. Silence. I tried to tell myself it was just the building settling or the wind outside, but the sense of unease didn't fade. I felt a cold draft brush against my neck, like someone had just passed by. I quickly left the area and went back to the main floor, my heart pounding in my chest. As I walked, I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was no one there. No one except for me. When I returned to the others, I didn't say anything. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The day after hearing those footsteps, I tried to shake off the unease. It wasn't easy. I had been in the plant for a few weeks at this point, and up until then, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Sure, there was a strange vibe to the place, but it was an old factory. I kept telling myself it was just my overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The feeling that had crept over me during the night shift hadn't dissipated. The unease lingered, hanging in the air like the thick layer of dust that seemed to never go away. I tried not to think about it. There was no point. I had a job to do, and I needed to focus. Rick, the guy I worked with most nights, noticed that I wasn't my usual self the following evening. He was a no-nonsense kind of guy who didn't waste words on anything he thought was trivial. But even he could sense something was off. "Something on your mind, kid?" Rick asked as we sat at the small break table in the corner of the plant. The low hum of the machinery filled the air, a constant reminder of the work we still had ahead of us. I hesitated for a moment. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "I don't know. It's just this place, Rick. It feels weird." Rick chuckled, his gruff voice echoing in the quiet room. "You'll get used to it. Old buildings like this do that to people. It's the silence, the isolation. It gets to your head if you let it." I nodded, though I wasn't convinced. There was something more than just the silence and isolation. There was something about the way the shadows shifted in the corners of the rooms, the way the temperature seemed to drop for no reason at all, the way doors would be left open when we knew no one had gone through them. But I didn't say any of that out loud. Rick wasn't the type to entertain those kinds of thoughts. The next shift rolled around, and I was determined to focus. I wasn't going to let myself get distracted by my imagination. It was just another night at the plant. That's what I told myself. But then, it happened again. I had been walking along the production floor, checking on a few machines that were acting up, when I heard the same thing. The footsteps. At first, I thought it was one of the other guys. But when I turned around, there was no one. The factory was empty, just like it always was at night. The sound echoed down the hallway, the clattering of boots against the concrete floor growing louder, almost mocking me. I froze. My heart raced. It wasn't just in my head. There was someone else in the plant with me. I didn't dare move. I stood there, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the sound stopped, just like it had before. Complete silence followed. I didn't stay there long. I quickly made my way back to the others, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that settled in my chest. When I reached the main floor, I found Rick sitting by the workbench, his back turned to me. I approached cautiously, trying to act normal, even though every instinct in me screamed that something was wrong. "You hear that?" I asked, my voice low, almost afraid of the answer. Rick didn't immediately respond. He just looked up at me, his face unreadable. "Hear what?" "The footsteps. I swear I heard footsteps. But there's no one else here." Rick didn't flinch. He didn't seem surprised or concerned. "Old plant. Old building. You get used to it." But I could tell there was something in his eyes. A flicker of recognition, maybe. I wasn't sure. Rick didn't say much, but I had a feeling he knew exactly what I was talking about. Maybe he had heard the same thing. Or maybe he had experienced something even stranger in that place. But he wasn't the type to share those kinds of stories. That night, I didn't want to be alone. I kept checking the shadows, scanning the dark corners of the factory, expecting to see something move. But nothing ever did. The only sounds were the machines, the faint hum of electricity in the walls. It was like the building itself was alive, but there was something about it that didn't feel natural. As the shift dragged on, I noticed something even stranger. The lights, Those flickering, dim bulbs that barely lit up the factory started to act up. They would flicker once, then twice, and then go out completely. The darkness would settle in for a few seconds before the lights flickered back on, but it was never steady. It was like someone or something was playing with the switches, toying with us. I could hear the sound of the machines in the distance, but it seemed like the noise was coming from further away than usual, almost as if the plant itself had grown larger, its walls stretching outward into the unknown. It felt disorienting, like I was trapped in a place that didn't make sense. I glanced over at Rick, hoping for some reassurance. But he was just sitting there, his eyes fixed on the workbench, unmoving. He didn't seem to notice the lights or the sounds. He didn't seem to care. I was about to ask him again if he had heard anything strange when the power went out completely. The whole plant was plunged into darkness. For a few moments, everything went silent. No machines, no hum of electricity, just the echo of my breathing in the void. I stood frozen, not knowing what to do. And then, just as suddenly as it had gone dark, the lights came back on. But something was different. The plant felt off. The atmosphere had shifted. I couldn't explain it, but it was like the whole place had changed in that brief moment of darkness. The walls felt closer, the air thicker, like something was waiting just out of sight. I looked at Rick again. His gaze hadn't moved, but this time I could see something in his eyes, a flicker of wariness. He wasn't looking at the workbench anymore. He was staring straight ahead, into the hallway where I had heard the footsteps earlier. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Rick didn't respond, but his jaw tightened. Slowly, he stood up, his heavy boots echoing in the silence. "Stay here," he muttered. "I'll go check it out." I didn't argue. I couldn't. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I wanted to grab him, tell him to stay, but I knew I had to let him go. I had no choice. Rick moved toward the hallway, his footsteps slow and deliberate. I watched him disappear into the shadows, the last of the light flickering out behind him. I waited in that cold silence, trying to ignore the pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure what I was waiting for. Rick's return. A sign that everything was okay. Or maybe, just maybe, I was hoping that what we were experiencing wasn't real. That it was just the mind playing tricks. But then I heard it again. The footsteps. Only this time, they were right behind me. I spun around, heart racing. There was nothing. Just the stillness of the plant. But the sound had been unmistakable. I wasn't alone. And it wasn't just in my head. I sat there, frozen, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what it just heard. The footsteps were no longer just a strange noise. They had become something real, something tangible. And I wasn't about to wait around for whatever it was to come closer. Rick hadn't come back yet. The minutes dragged on like hours. Every second that ticked by felt heavier, thicker. The atmosphere had shifted again, thickened with an unspoken tension. The hum of the machinery felt distant, almost hollow, like it was coming from somewhere deep beneath the floors. I glanced nervously around the factory, my eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. But no matter how hard I looked, I couldn't find the source of the noise. My senses were on high alert. My breathing was shallow, as if I were trying to avoid drawing attention to myself in a place where I felt like an intruder. The air around me seemed to grow colder, too. I shivered involuntarily. I had worked night shifts in factories for years, but I had never felt the chill like this. It wasn't just the temperature. It was the kind of cold that sank into your bones, like something was deliberately trying to make you feel small and insignificant. I rubbed my arms, trying to get some warmth back into them, but the cold wouldn't go away. Then I heard it again. A faint sound, footsteps, but this time they weren't behind me. They were coming from the other end of the hall. Closer, louder. I could feel the pressure in my chest as the noise drew nearer. It wasn't just the echo of my mind playing tricks. I was sure of it now. There was something, or someone, moving through the darkened plant with me. My mind raced. I had to figure out what was going on. I couldn't just sit here waiting for the inevitable. Something wasn't right. The factory had always been a place of constant motion, with machines running around the clock. But tonight, everything felt different. I stood up slowly, the creak of the chair loud in the silence. My heart was pounding in my ears, but I had to do something. I had to find out what was happening before it drove me mad. I didn't want to be the one to chicken out. I wasn't like that. And I wasn't going to let some unexplained footsteps make me lose control. I moved toward the hallway where I'd heard the noise before, the one where the shadows seemed to stretch impossibly long. The walls seemed to close in on me as I walked, as if the plant itself was trying to swallow me whole. The closer I got to the end of the hall, the more the air seemed to grow thick and heavy, suffocating almost. My stomach twisted, and a knot of dread lodged in my throat. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find, but I knew it wouldn't be good. I reached the corner, the place where the noise had originated. But just as I was about to peek around it, I heard a faint crackling sound, like something was being dragged across the floor. It was coming from the room beyond the corner. My eyes locked on the dark doorway. The sound was unmistakable, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to find out what it was. But my curiosity, no, my need for answers, pushed me forward. I took a slow step toward the doorway, trying to stay as quiet as possible. My hands were clammy, my breath ragged in my chest. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn around and run. But I couldn't. Not now. I had to know what was going on. I reached the threshold, my eyes straining to adjust to the darkness inside. The room was large, filled with shelves, crates, and old machines that hadn't been used in years. It was exactly the kind of place I would expect to find something unusual, an old storage room, forgotten by everyone, even the people who worked there. And then I saw it. In the far corner of the room, there was a figure. It was a shadow at first, a dark shape hunched over. The figure was moving slowly, dragging something heavy across the floor. I couldn't see its face, but the way it moved was wrong, jerky, like it wasn't quite human. My breath caught in my throat. My legs felt like they were made of stone, unable to move, but I forced myself to take another step forward. I couldn't just stand there like a coward. I needed to know what this was. The figure continued to move, seemingly unaware of my presence, or maybe it just didn't care. As I inched closer, I saw that it wasn't dragging anything. It was dragging itself. The figure's body was twisted and broken, its arms and legs bending at unnatural angles. It moved with an eerie determination, dragging its misshapen form across the floor, leaving a trail of blood and grime behind it. A chill ran down my spine. This wasn't just a person. This wasn't something that should be here. I could feel my heartbeat thudding in my chest, the sound of it echoing in my ears. My instinct screamed at me to run, to get the hell out of there, but my feet were rooted to the spot. I was paralyzed by fear. What kind of thing was this? What was it? And why was it here? Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The room was silent again, except for the steady hum of the machines in the distance. I looked around, trying to figure out where the figure had gone, but it had vanished. I was alone. My eyes darted around, searching for any sign of the twisted thing, but there was nothing. It was like it had never been there at all. I stood there, frozen, my heart still racing, unsure of what to do next. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. All I could do was stare at the empty room, wondering if I had imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. What I had seen was real, and it wasn't over. Rick still hadn't come back. I turned, moving quickly, but quietly, back toward the hallway. My hands were shaking. My body was still tense, as if I was on the verge of something terrible happening. I needed to find Rick. I needed someone else to confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. I moved toward the break room, but as I reached the door, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, standing in the doorway, was Rick. He didn't say anything. His face was pale, his eyes wide with what could only be described as fear. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, and his chest rose and fell rapidly, as if he had been running. But he hadn't been running. I hadn't heard him coming. And now I was sure that whatever I had just seen was real. Rick's expression told me everything I needed to know. Something had changed. Something was here with us, and it wasn't going away. Rick's wide eyes stared at me, his mouth slightly agape, as if he had just witnessed something beyond comprehension. He hadn't said a word. Neither of us moved for what felt like an eternity. The only sound was the hum of the machinery in the distance, and the occasional creak of the old building settling. Every inch of my skin felt as though it were alive, tingling with the pressure of something unseen, something waiting. I finally broke the silence, my voice hoarse. "Rick, what happened? What did you see?" He shook his head slowly, his lips trembling. He looked like he was about to speak, but couldn't find the words. It was like he was trying to form a sentence, but his body refused to cooperate. Then, finally, he spoke, but what came out wasn't what I expected. "I saw it." I didn't need to ask what he meant. I already knew. "I heard it too," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "I heard the footsteps. And I saw it in that room." Rick flinched, his eyes darting toward the break room door, as if expecting the figure to appear again, out of the shadows. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. There was something deeply wrong in the air now, something that even the heavy machinery couldn't drown out. "I didn't think it was real at first," Rick continued, his voice trembling. "I thought it was just my mind playing tricks. But when I went down the hallway, I saw it too. It was dragging itself across the floor, just like you said. And its face. God, its face." His words trailed off, his breath coming faster, as if he were reliving the moment. The dread in my chest grew heavier. "What happened to it, Rick? Where did it go?" Rick's gaze flickered nervously to the hallway behind us, and I knew we both had the same thought. The thing was still out there, somewhere in the dark recesses of the factory. It hadn't disappeared. It was just waiting, watching, and it knew we were here. A noise echoed from down the hall, a low, dragging sound. My stomach twisted, and the blood in my veins seemed to freeze. I grabbed Rick's arm, pulling him away from the doorway. "We have to go. Now." My voice was urgent, strained. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get out of this place, but the heavy dread in my gut wouldn't let me move fast enough. My legs felt like they were made of lead. We moved quickly but quietly, trying to keep our steps light, the sounds of our shoes hitting the floor, a stark contrast to the silence that had fallen over the factory. The further we moved, the closer the sound seemed to get. I could feel it now, that creeping sense of something hunting us. It wasn't just footsteps anymore. It was something much worse. We reached the hallway that led to the exit. Rick was breathing hard beside me, and I could see his hands trembling, his palms slick with sweat. I couldn't even look at him. I was too focused on what lay ahead. The exit door wasn't far, but every step I took felt like it was taking me farther from safety. Then it happened. The door that had been standing open just moments ago slammed shut with a deafening crash. We both froze in place. For a moment, I thought my heart had stopped beating. The silence was unbearable. Rick's voice broke through the tension. "It's here." I didn't need to ask what he meant. I knew. The figure that had been haunting us, the thing that had dragged itself through the factory like some twisted version of a human being, It was standing just behind us, waiting for the right moment. The air around us thickened, and I could feel it on my skin. My breathing quickened, but I couldn't make myself move. The dread in my chest was suffocating, a weight I could no longer carry. I could hear Rick's labored breaths beside me, and I knew he was just as scared as I was. And then the sound came again, the dragging sound. This time, it was louder, more pronounced, as if the creature was right behind us. I slowly turned around, my heart pounding in my ears, my pulse thundering in my veins. There, at the far end of the hallway, was the figure. It was closer now, much closer than before. Its movements were jerky and uneven, like it was stumbling, but it didn't stop. It just kept coming, dragging itself forward with slow, deliberate steps. Its face, if you could even call it a face, was barely recognizable. The skin was stretched taut, as if it had been pulled too tight, and its eyes were wide open, black holes staring into the void. It didn't have a mouth, just a hollow, gaping wound that seemed to be sucking in the darkness. And it was getting closer. Rick let out a strangled gasp, and I knew we couldn't outrun it. There was no escape. The thing stopped in front of us, just a few feet away, and we were both paralyzed with fear. It didn't make a sound, just stood there, its head tilting ever so slightly as if studying us. And then it did something I hadn't expected. It spoke, but the voice that came from it wasn't a voice at all. It was a noise, something like a tortured rasp, the sound of metal scraping against metal. It was the kind of noise that made your skin crawl and your blood run cold. The words were impossible to understand, but the tone, there was no mistaking it. It was asking something. It was demanding something from us. I could feel my heart racing, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my throat. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to move. All I could do was stare at it, frozen in terror, as it continued to study us with those empty, soulless eyes. And then it did something worse. It reached out with a single, gnarled hand, fingers twisted in impossible angles, and touched Rick. The contact was instantaneous, and the moment it happened, Rick's body jerked as if he had been electrocuted. His eyes widened, his mouth opened in a silent scream, but no sound came out. I watched in horror as his body began to crumble, the bones snapping, the skin peeling away in great chunks, until there was nothing left but a pile of flesh and bone. I screamed. I couldn't help it. It felt like the world had shattered around me. The creature turned its gaze toward me, and I knew that I was next. There was nothing I could do, nothing I could say. I was at the mercy of something far worse than anything I could ever have imagined. I closed my eyes, bracing for whatever came next. But just as quickly as it had started, the room went silent again. When I opened my eyes, the factory was empty. I didn't understand what had just happened. The air around me was thick with tension, but it was still. No dragging sounds, no creaking of floorboards, and no more disturbing, grotesque creatures staring at me. It was as though time itself had frozen, suspended in the chilling aftermath of what I had just witnessed. I looked around, half expecting the creature to reappear from the shadows, but there was nothing. Just the echoes of my own breathing and the hum of the industrial machinery still running in the distance. The world felt wrong, out of sync, and every inch of me screamed to leave, to escape this nightmare. But I couldn't. My legs trembled, refusing to move. I had seen what had happened to Rick, his body torn apart in front of my eyes, and I could still hear the sound of his bones breaking, his scream that had never escaped his lips. His face, wide with terror, was burned into my memory, a constant reminder that whatever we had faced, it wasn't something we could just walk away from. I stumbled back, my foot brushing against something cold. Looking down, I saw a piece of Rick's clothing, torn and stained. It was the only trace of him left. The rest had vanished, just like the creature. Had it taken him, consumed him, or had it simply erased him from existence? I reached down, grasping the fabric in my trembling hand. There was no comfort to be found in it. No answers, no closure. I had to leave. That much was certain. I couldn't stay in this place any longer. The factory, which had once been just an ordinary industrial building to me, had now become a haunting prison. I had to get out, to breathe fresh air, to feel something that wasn't tainted by the horrors I had witnessed. But the question lingered in my mind. Was it over? I didn't know. The factory seemed to resist my attempts to leave. Each hallway I tried to walk down felt like it twisted into another, pulling me deeper into the labyrinth. The exit doors were still locked tight, and the windows that had once been clear were now clouded with grime and condensation, as if the very building was trying to keep me trapped inside. I could feel the presence of the creature, lingering just out of sight. Even though I couldn't hear it, I could feel it in the air. It was watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Maybe it was biding its time, or maybe I was just too paranoid to let go of the terror that gripped me. But it didn't matter. The fear was real, and it gnawed at me like an ever-present force. The weight of the situation settled in on me, and I realized something even more unsettling. I couldn't remember how long I had been in this place. Time had warped. My watch, which had been working just hours ago, now showed nothing but a blank screen. It felt like I had been trapped in this nightmare for days, though I couldn't say for sure. Had I only been here for hours? Or had it been longer? The uncertainty gnawed at me. But then, a soft noise broke the silence, the sound of footsteps, slow but distinct. Not the dragging of the creature this time, but something more human, something more real. I turned, my heart pounding in my chest, my hands clammy with sweat. But there was no one there. The hallway was empty. No figures, no monsters, just the faint echo of my own breath. I had never felt more alone in my life. I moved toward the exit again, this time more determined. I couldn't linger any longer. Whatever had happened to Rick, whatever that creature was, it was out of my control. I needed to escape, to get far, far away from this place. I reached the main door to the outside. The fresh air hit me like a shock, a welcome relief from the suffocating atmosphere of the factory. For a moment, I stood there, feeling the cool breeze against my skin, inhaling the scent of the night, trying to ground myself in the reality of the world beyond the factory walls. But the door didn't feel right. The heavy metal door that had once been sturdy and secure now felt wrong. I tried to push it open, but it didn't budge. It was locked. How? I thought. How could this be happening? I pulled harder, but the door wouldn't open. My panic surged again, and for a moment, I thought I might lose it completely. Was I still trapped? Was I still in the factory's grip, or had the world outside just disappeared? Then I heard it. A voice! It was faint, like a whisper, but it cut through the fear like a blade. I spun around, expecting to see someone, but again, I found nothing. The hallway was empty. Help me, the voice pleaded, soft but desperate. My heart stopped. The voice, it wasn't mine. It wasn't Rick's. It was coming from deeper in the factory. The same voice I had heard before, faint but unmistakable. And this time, it wasn't just asking for help. It was calling for me. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but the voice, so familiar, so full of pain, drew me in like a moth to a flame. Without thinking, I stepped away from the exit door, following the voice. I had to know. I had to find out what had happened to Rick, what had caused all of this, and why this place felt like it had swallowed us whole. I moved deeper into the building, my footsteps heavy in the silence. The lights flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out before me, distorting the hallways. The air was colder now, colder than it had been before, and the further I went, the more oppressive it became. The voice grew louder as I walked, each step taking me closer to something I couldn't quite grasp. I knew I should turn back. I knew I should run, but I couldn't stop myself. It was like I had no choice but to follow the sound, to keep moving deeper into the dark unknown. And then I found it. The room. The one place I hadn't dared to explore before. The one that had been locked until now. The door creaked open with a slow, agonizing screech. Inside, the room was pitch dark. I could hear the faint rustling of movement, the scratching of something against the walls. And then, just like before, the sound of dragging footsteps. I stepped inside. And then, everything went dark. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the factory. The cold, damp air had been replaced by a thick warmth, and the familiar hum of industrial machinery was gone. I found myself standing in a field, surrounded by the sounds of wind and rustling grass. I could smell the earthy scent of the soil beneath me, and for a moment I thought I had escaped. Maybe I was no longer trapped in that dreadful place. But that sense of relief didn't last long. I knew something wasn't right. I looked around, my heart still racing. The field stretched on in all directions, but there were no landmarks, no signs of civilization. It was as if I had stepped into another world, one that was both familiar and impossibly alien at the same time. The sky above me was overcast, dark clouds hanging low like they might burst open at any moment. And then I saw it. In the distance, standing just at the edge of the field, was a figure. A man. Or what used to be a man. The figure was still, and as I focused on it, my breath caught in my throat. It was Rick. His body, still wearing the torn clothes he had been wearing before, stood motionless, facing away from me. But something was wrong. His posture was unnatural, stiff, his head tilted at an odd angle. The way he stood felt wrong. It felt as though he wasn't alive. But it wasn't just that. As I stared at him, I realized that the space around him seemed to bend, warping in subtle, unsettling ways. The air shimmered like heat rising from pavement on a summer's day, and I could see faint images flickering in the corner of my eyes. Fragments of things that didn't belong in this place. Shadows stretching out unnaturally. Objects appearing and disappearing in the blink of an eye. This wasn't just another reality. It was distorted, twisted by something far beyond our understanding. I took a hesitant step forward, my legs shaking beneath me. Despite the overwhelming urge to run, I couldn't tear my eyes away from Rick. I couldn't leave him there. The voice had called to me. Maybe this was the only way to understand what had happened, to make sense of the horror. I called out, my voice trembling.
Rick?
He didn't move, didn't respond. The figure remained frozen, like a mannequin caught in an unblinking stare. But that's when I realized he wasn't just standing there. He was watching me. The faintest flicker in his eyes caught my attention, and then the shadow behind him moved. I froze. The creature. It was here. Its presence was unmistakable. I could feel it more than I could see it, a shifting sensation in the air, as though the very fabric of reality was trembling. The temperature dropped, and I felt a chill seep into my bones. I knew that the creature wasn't just following me, it was waiting, and it had found me. I turned to run, but the ground beneath me was changing, shifting like liquid. The once solid earth was now soft and unstable, pulling at my feet as though the very world was trying to swallow me whole. I stumbled, falling into a mass of writhing, dark shapes that twisted around me, cold hands gripping my ankles. No! I screamed in my mind. I couldn't move. The ground tightened its grip, and as I looked up, I saw Rick's form again. This time, his eyes were wide open, empty, and filled with the same terror that had marked his final moments. He reached out toward me, but it was too late. The creature was here. But just as it reached for me, a blinding light exploded from the distance, lighting up the sky. It wasn't the sun. There was no source, just pure, unrelenting light that filled the space around me, forcing everything to stop, to freeze. The shadows recoiled, and for a moment, everything was still. The creature let out an agonized, guttural roar, a sound that shook the air around me. And then, it vanished. The world fell silent again. I could feel the ground shift beneath me, releasing its hold, and I stumbled to my feet, gasping for air. But the light, it wasn't over. It had come from somewhere, from someone, or something. And in that instant, I realized that the field, the twisted reality, the creature, it was all part of something bigger, something that I still didn't fully understand. I didn't know how long I stood there, lost in that surreal space between reality and whatever had been unleashed. But eventually, the light began to fade, and the world slowly returned to normal. The sky cleared, the oppressive atmosphere lifted, and I was left standing alone in the field once again. I could hear the sounds of the world, the wind rustling the grass, the distant hum of traffic, the chirp of birds. But the factory, it was gone. The haunting presence had lifted, and I was left with only the fading memory of what had happened. Was it over? Was I free? The question lingered, unanswered. As I walked away from the field, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something inside me had broken, and I was no longer the person I had been before entering that factory. I had faced something unimaginable, something that defied logic and reason, and I had survived. But at what cost? I didn't know if I would ever truly escape the memory of what had happened. I didn't know if I would ever be free from the things I had seen, the terror that had clawed its way into my soul. I didn't know if the creature would ever return, if the factory would open its doors again, or if Rick's fate would remain a haunting mystery forever. All I knew was this: I would never look at the world the same way again. Some things aren't meant to be understood, and some doors shouldn't be opened. The truth had been too much to bear. But perhaps, just perhaps, that was the price of survival.